Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, we set out barefoot on a holy journey, which in plain medieval terms means walking until your feet resemble boiled turnips and your soul smells faintly of fermented cabbage. Forget angelic visions or heavenly choirs. What you'll actually encounter are blisters that could be mistaken for extra toes, the constant threat of dysentery lurking in every muddy puddle, and fellow travellers who snore like dying oxen. And yet you trudge on, clutching your tin badge and muttering prayers, because at the end of this road lies a shrine where someone swears a cracked rib in a gilded box once belonged to Saint whoever. This is the story about a medieval pilgrimage. Before we begin, be sure to like, share and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket and let's travel together. Way, way back together. The journey itself is less pilgrimage and more endurance trial, a test of how much mud, hunger, and badly tuned chanting one soul can survive before collapsing in a ditch. The roads are rutted with cart tracks that double as open sewers, and every village you pass greets you not with angelic hospitality, but with side-eyed suspicion and cabbage soup so watery it might actually qualify as holy water. Sleep is snatched in barns, under hedges, or beside campfires that never seem to warm anything but the smoke in your eyes. Each morning you rise with joints creaking like church doors, convinced you must surely be holier simply for surviving another night without being robbed, trampled, or eaten alive by the local rat population. The first thing you'll notice is the thirst. Pilgrimages aren't known for their refreshments. Imagine walking 10 miles in the summer sun with nothing but a goatskin of water that tastes like someone strained it through a sheep's armpit. Wells, if you find them, are communal cesspits where every coughing peasant, half-dead mule and questionable traveller dips their ladle. Drink too much, and congratulations. You've just enrolled in the medieval dysentery marathon. Refuse, and you'll simply desiccate like a saint's relic before you ever reach the shrine. Now let's talk about food, or the lack thereof. Your daily diet on this holy trek is bread so hard it could double as roofing tile, and cheese that's mostly mould with a little dairy still clinging on for dignity. If you're lucky, you'll catch a vendor selling questionable meat pies along the roadside. Meat, of course, is a generous term. Rat, crow, or something that barked in its former life. A bite fills your stomach, yes, but it also fills you with a growing suspicion that confession won't cover what's happening to your digestive tract. Along the road, you'll meet fellow pilgrims, each a walking cautionary tale. There's the toothless farmer who swears he's walking to Compostela to atone for stealing a chicken, though the only thing he seems to carry is a skin rash that's spreading like wildfire. There's the widow with 3 children, one of whom keeps coughing up something that sounds suspiciously tubercular, and another who cries every time you pass a graveyard, which is often since these roads are dotted with more shallow graves than waymarkers. And then, of course, the nobleman who insists on being carried in a litter while loudly complaining about the smell of peasants. Everyone hates him, but not enough to put him out of his misery. The sleeping arrangements are where the real fun begins. Forget inns, those are for the wealthy. You'll bed down in barns, ditches, or if you're truly blessed, next to a pig, and you'll be thankful for the pig, because at least it generates body heat. Fleas will crawl across your scalp in the moonlight like they're mapping a crusade of their own, and lice will burrow into seams of your cloak as though it were prime real estate. The next morning you'll wake scratching furiously, wondering if sainthood is really worth developing buboes in places you can't politely scratch in public. The spiritual part of the pilgrimage doesn't fare much better. Shrines are advertised like miracle supermarkets. Holy toenails, saintly knuckle bones, bits of cloth soaked in somebody's blood. You trudge 100 miles to reach one, kneel reverently, and stare at what looks suspiciously like the femur of a goat wrapped in gold leaf. The priest assures you it cures gout, blindness, and boils. You nod solemnly, while wondering if your life really improved by swapping one form of medieval scam for another. But danger doesn't just come from fleas and fraudulent relics. The roads are long, winding, and home to everyone the sheriff didn't want to deal with. Highwaymen, mercenaries between wars, the occasional excommunicated monk. These are your fellow travellers too. The church will tell you that God will protect his pilgrims, but God is suspiciously absent when you're being relieved of your shoes, cloak and dignity by a man with 3 teeth and a knife that still has someone else's blood on it. If you're especially unfortunate, you'll wake up in the middle of the night with someone rummaging through your pack, helpfully redistributing your worldly possessions to themselves. Of course, there's also the weather. Rain isn't just wet. It's acidic enough to dissolve the glue in your sandals, so you walk barefoot, slicing your feet open on rocks that look sharpened specifically for the purpose. When the sun comes out, it's merciless, beating down until you hallucinate that a roadside puddle is the River Jordan. You stumble toward it, collapse, and discover it's nothing but a mud pit where a donkey has been enthusiastically relieving itself. Drink anyway, and hope that divine intervention comes in the form of not vomiting until the next village. If the natural world doesn't finish you, disease might. Pilgrimage routes are mobile petri dishes. Coughing, sneezing, hacking pilgrims shuffle along in packs, sharing everything from lice to leprosy. There's no polite way to decline when someone offers you a sip from their drinking horn, already wet with their saliva, and possibly something more sinister. Every step you take is a gamble. Do you die of thirst? Or do you drink and roll the dice on whether it's cholera, typhoid, or plain old medieval diarrhea that'll do you in first? And yet, despite all this, the pilgrim presses on, because the promise of salvation, eternal life, a lighter conscience, maybe even bragging rights back home, glimmers faintly at the end of the trail like a candle in a very draughty chapel. You imagine yourself arriving at the holy site, lips cracked, eyes sunken, smelling like a compost heap. You'll kneel, kiss the relic, and perhaps even feel something stir in your chest that isn't indigestion, and then you'll begin the long walk home, which is everything you've already suffered through. Only now you're broke, twice as sick, and carrying nothing but a small badge pinned to your cloak that says, in essence, I walked very far and all I got was this lousy pilgrim badge. What's a pilgrimage without music? You'll soon discover that pilgrims sing as they walk, not because they're happy, but because it drowns out the sound of their stomachs eating themselves. The songs are repetitive chants about saints, miracles, and the occasional thinly veiled complaint about blisters. One particularly popular tune, Ultria, translates roughly to keep going, which is ironic because most of the singers will collapse from heatstroke before the next village. If you think medieval hymn singing is uplifting, wait until you hear a chorus of 50 half-starved peasants droning through cracked throats. It's less angelic choir, more death rattle set to a steady rhythm. Of course, an entire economy thrives on your suffering. Enter the souvenir industry. Along the way, you'll find hawkers selling scallop shells, badges and trinkets, supposedly blessed by saints. Pilgrim badges, stamped from cheap tin, were the medieval equivalent of buying a I Heart Lords t-shirt. They didn't ward off demons or heal gout, but they did mark you as someone gullible enough to buy one. Villagers along popular routes built their entire livelihoods on catering to pilgrims, overpriced ale, counterfeit relics, and beds so infested with vermin they could crawl away on their own if you ask nicely. And don't think the church missed out on this racket. Monasteries set up pilgrim hostels, which is medieval marketing for pay us to sleep in a draughty hall with 100 snoring strangers. They'd feed you gruel, bless you with water so holy it might have been scooped from the same bucket as the pig trough, and send you on your way lighter in both body and coin. Priests were masters of upselling. For a few extra pennies they'd absolve not just your sins, but possibly your neighbours too, though the fine print on salvation was always suspiciously vague. The road itself could feel like an endless punishment. Forget neatly paved highways. Most routes were muddy tracks that turned into bogs at the first drizzle. You might find yourself waist-deep in muck, clinging to a half-submerged fence post, praying to St. Anthony not for guidance but for a rope. Bridges where they existed were fragile wooden things built by the lowest bidder. Crossing one meant gambling whether it would hold your weight or send you splashing into a river already filled with animal carcasses, rotting laundry, and the occasional unlucky pilgrim who didn't make it. And then there were the miracles every shrine boasted them. Someone claimed to have been cured of blindness after kissing a toenail, or a child's fever miraculously broke after touching a scrap of cloth said to belong to the Virgin Mary's cousin's servant's neighbour. Skeptics muttered, but loudly declaring disbelief was dangerous in a world where being accused of heresy could earn you a nice toasty evening tied to a stake. So pilgrims nodded earnestly, coughed discreetly into their lice-infested cloaks, and hoped their own boils might vanish after paying the relic's suggested donation. Returning home wasn't any kinder. Imagine stumbling into your village months later, gaunt as a scarecrow, clutching a badge that proves you went to Santiago or Canterbury. Your neighbours will nod respectfully, then immediately ask for souvenirs or miracle water. If you didn't bring any, and you probably didn't, because the only thing you carried home was tuberculosis, you'll be accused of faking the whole trip. Your family will marvel at your spiritual transformation, while also resenting the fact you returned with more lice than you left with. And God help you if you try to show off by recounting the whole ordeal. Most villagers will pretend to listen, then sneak out to the alehouse halfway through your dysentery story. And just when you thought the ordeal ended, let's not forget indulgences. Many pilgrims returned not enlightened but in debt. Churches happily sold certificates proving you'd shaved centuries off your time in purgatory, like some medieval loyalty card. Walk 500 miles and you're promised a shorter afterlife queue. Can't make the trip? No problem. You could pay a proxy pilgrim to suffer on your behalf. That meant some poor wretch trudged through the muck, kissed the relics, and returned with paperwork bearing your name. It was the original outsourcing model, only instead of tech support in another country, you were paying a stranger to risk plague for you. Scams were as common on pilgrimage routes as lice in a pilgrim's hair. Entire towns specialised in fleecing travellers. You'd shuffle into a village, weary and starving, and be greeted by a cheerful merchant offering authentic relics. A splinter from the true cross, a vial of the Virgin's tears, or, for a bargain, a feather from the Archangel Gabriel himself. Of course, the splinter looked suspiciously like last week's firewood, the tears tasted suspiciously of rainwater, and the feather was clearly from the backside of a goose. But what could you say? Call it a fraud, and you'd be the heretic. Buy it, and you're the idiot. The medieval marketplace left no safe option, except starvation, which was free of charge. And let's not forget the joy of encountering crusaders on the march. While you're hobbling along praying for blister relief, you might find yourself overtaken by armed men shouting about God's will and stomping off to butcher strangers in foreign lands. They'd look at you, a filthy peasant with an open sore on your leg, and sneer that your pilgrimage wasn't real suffering. Nothing bonds humanity quite like one person telling another they're not suffering enough. Meanwhile, they'll steal your food, commandeer your donkey, and tell you it's in the name of Christ. Which makes it holy theft, apparently. Communication was another hell. Pilgrimages crossed borders, which meant you'd wander into lands where nobody spoke your language. Imagine asking where the nearest well is, but instead of help you get confused stares and maybe a stick waved in your direction. Hand gestures solved some problems, but they also created new ones. The universal medieval sign for water might accidentally mean, "Please rob me." And even if you managed to understand, accents were so thick and dialects so fractured that you could be arguing over directions for hours before realising they'd been pointing you back the way you came. Superstitions clung to pilgrims like mud on boots. Every village along the road had its own omens, charms and rituals. Step on the wrong side of a wayside cross and you might be cursed. Forget to bow at a shrine and you'll sprout boils. Whisper the wrong prayer and suddenly you're marked for demonic possession. Desperate pilgrims carried charms of all sorts, amulets made from wolf teeth, herbs stuffed in pouches, or even the desiccated toe of a saint they'd borrowed from an altar. None of it stopped the lice, of course, but it made them feel slightly less ridiculous while scratching themselves raw. Then there was the weather's cruel timing. Heat would bake you until your cloak felt like it was woven from molten iron, only for storms to roll in an hour later and drench you so thoroughly you squelched for miles. Pilgrims didn't carry spare clothing. Why lug another sack of damp misery? Instead, you'd dry your cloak over a smoky fire, inhaling enough fumes to half-poison yourself, while praying it didn't rain again before morning. Spoiler, it always rained again before morning. The road was less a path to salvation than a cycle of being roasted, soaked and smoked like a medieval ham. Pilgrim hospitals were meant to be havens, but they were really warehouses for the half-dead. Cots packed shoulder to shoulder, filled with coughing, wheezing and moaning bodies. The air was thick with the smell of old sweat, damp straw and whatever disease was fashionable that month. The monks who ran these hostels handed out healing concoctions, herbal brews so bitter they stripped the taste buds off your tongue, or purgatives that sent you sprinting for the ditch. If you survived, you'd swear the herbs worked. If you didn't, well, you'd still count as a successful patient, since technically you reached the afterlife, which was the ultimate destination anyway. And then, if by some cosmic accident you actually survived the pilgrimage and returned home in one piece, the fun wasn't over. You were expected to be a changed person, brimming with spiritual wisdom. Instead, you'd stand before your village, emaciated, scarred, and scratching incessantly. The priest would beam, the neighbours would nod, and the children would point out that you smelled like someone who had been sleeping with pigs, which, of course, you had. Your soul might be lighter, but your purse was empty, your stomach was hollow, and your only prize was a badge made of tin that looked like it belonged on a cheap carnival ride. Let's take a moment to admire the fashion of the medieval pilgrim. Spoiler, you won't find it in vogue. A typical pilgrim uniform consisted of a rough wool cloak, a wide-brimmed hat shaped like someone sat on it, and a wooden staff tall enough to double as a jousting lance. To top it all off, the infamous pilgrim's badge, a tin trinket pinned proudly to your chest, announcing your gullibility like a medieval billboard. The outfit wasn't designed for comfort, it was designed so innkeepers could spot you from a distance and immediately raise their prices. And while the staff might look impressive, it was mostly used for swatting away aggressive dogs or, in a pinch, your fellow pilgrims when they tried to borrow your food. Speaking of dogs, animals on the road added their own brand of misery. Stray hounds haunted pilgrim routes, sniffing at packs, gnawing on sandals, and occasionally helping themselves to the loaf of bread you'd been hoarding for 3 days. Horses weren't much better. Pilgrims on foot were constantly shoved aside by mounted nobles, who treated the road like their personal runway, spattering peasants with mud as they passed. Donkeys, meanwhile, were both lifelines and liabilities. Sure, they carried supplies, but they also had the stamina of a sulking toddler. When your donkey decided it had walked enough for the day, nothing short of divine intervention, or a very large stick, would move it. And then there were the smells. Pilgrimages weren't exactly fragrant excursions. Imagine thousands of unwashed bodies marching together, each one marinated in sweat, dirt, and whatever illness they were brewing. Soap existed, yes, but it was about as popular as tax collectors. Bathing was often discouraged as unhealthy, or worse, immoral, since exposing your naked flesh was believed to invite sin, or, at the very least, scandalized commentary. The result was a miasma so potent it could strip paint from the walls of a chapel. Mix in the aromas of rotting animal carcasses on the roadside, overflowing latrines, and the occasional dead pilgrim, and you've got a perfume so noxious it could be bottled under the name eau de penance. Entertainment on the road was its own brand of bleak. When you weren't praying, you were swapping stories, many of which were so exaggerated they bordered on medieval stand-up comedy. Someone always claimed they knew a man who was cured of gout by licking a saint's sandal. Another swore he'd seen a miracle candle burn for a year without wax, though suspiciously no one else had ever witnessed it. Gambling was popular too, especially with dice, though winning often meant inheriting your opponent's fleas. And when the dice ran out, pilgrims invented games with rocks, sticks, or whatever hadn't been stolen yet. Think of it as medieval Monopoly, except instead of fighting over fake money, you fought over the last edible crust of bread. The psychology of the pilgrimage was another hidden torment. At the start, spirits ran high. Pilgrims imagined themselves heroes trudging nobly toward salvation. By the second week, reality set in. You weren't a hero, you were a mud-smeared peasant with a limp. Group morale swung like a broken bell. One day, everyone sang hymns with gusto. The next, the group was silent, save for the sound of someone coughing up something chunky. Squabbles erupted over everything. Who got the shady spot under the tree, who stole whose hunk of cheese, or who snored so loudly the others contemplated smothering them with a cloak. It was less a holy journey, and more a rolling experiment in mass irritation, and of course law enforcement was practically non-existent. Local sheriffs weren't about to waste time chasing thieves through bogs, so pilgrims were expected to police themselves. Vigilante justice was common. Catch someone stealing and they might be tied to a tree, flogged, or simply abandoned by the roadside. Accusations of theft flew constantly, whether true or not. Lose your bread? Must have been the toothless farmer. Misplace your badge? Obviously the widow's fault. In reality, half the time the item had simply fallen into the mud, where it was quickly swallowed forever by the road's hungry sludge. Even medicine became a cruel joke. Should you fall ill, the remedies available were indistinguishable from punishments. Fever? Time for a round of bloodletting, because clearly losing a pint of blood will cure dehydration. Stomachache? Enjoy a concoction of wormwood and vinegar that tastes like someone wrung out a medieval dish rag. Headache? Try wearing a poultice made of herbs, dung, and mystery goo plastered directly onto your temples. If you survived the cure, congratulations. You were clearly divinely favoured. If you didn't, the monks wrote you off as God's will, and everyone else divided up your belongings before your body got cold. Pilgrim politics were as cutthroat as anything in a royal court. Despite the pious image of humble travellers bound together by faith, there was a constant undercurrent of competition. Who got to the shrine first? Who had the loudest prayer? Whose suffering was the most authentic? Pilgrims compared blisters like badges of honour, each insisting their personal agony was more saintly than anyone else's. The nobleman carried in a litter, of course, insisted his suffering was spiritual, which is medieval code for I'm wealthy enough to avoid the mud. Peasants scowled at him, monks muttered disapproval, and yet everyone still shuffled aside when he demanded the first sip of holy water at the well. The hierarchy of misery was rigid. Money trumped faith every time. Arriving at a town on the route could feel less like a respite and more like being a sideshow attraction. Locals were quick to capitalise on the spectacle. Children pointed at your filthy cloak and laughed, while innkeepers hovered like vultures offering pilgrim discounts that were anything but. Foreign towns were the worst. Customs varied wildly, and it was easy to stumble into insult without realising it. Refuse the wrong food, and you'd be branded ungrateful. Accept the wrong food, and you'd be bedridden for 3 days with bowels that emptied like a breached dam. Meanwhile, the local taverns saw you as walking coin purses, ripe for draining with weak ale, bad stew, and the occasional bar fight when someone accused you of looking at their pig the wrong way. Then there were processions. Every so often a major town along the route would stage a religious procession, and pilgrims were expected to join. At first, this sounded promising. A bit of pomp, a chance to walk behind banners instead of trudging through muck. The reality: hours of standing in the sun while clergy paraded relics that looked suspiciously like random bones dug out of the parish graveyard. The crowd pressed so tightly you could barely breathe, and when the relic was finally raised, a mad scramble broke out as pilgrims elbowed each other for the privilege of kissing it first. Few things are more spiritual than being kneed in the ribs while watching someone smear their runny nose across the shin bone of a long-dead saint. Hospitality was another medieval joke. In theory, Christian charity meant towns along the route welcome pilgrims with open arms. In practice, it was a game of, how much can we exploit you before you catch on? Some monasteries locked their doors after sundown, leaving late arrivals to sleep in ditches. Others offered food so meagre it would make prison gruel look like a banquet. The bread was stale, the ale watered down, and the stew suspiciously chewy. You ate it anyway because hunger was worse than dignity. And should you dare to complain, you'd be reminded that the point of pilgrimage was suffering, so really, they were doing you a favour. Conflict among pilgrims themselves was almost inevitable. After weeks of travelling together, the smallest irritations festered into open hostility. Someone snored too loudly. Someone else hogged the fire, another whispered the rosary offbeat and ruined the rhythm. Fistfights broke out over stolen cloaks or borrowed shoes. Groups splintered, with former companions trudging apart in sullen silence. But pilgrims were practical. By the next morning, after a shared scare from a bandit or rabid dog, grudges were quietly dropped. Nothing smoothed over interpersonal strife like the possibility of dying together. Still, the air was thick with muttered curses and barely suppressed glares as you limped onward. And let's not forget the joy of paperwork. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, bureaucracy found a way to make itself miserable. At major shrines, pilgrims could collect documents called testimonia to prove they had actually visited. These were official letters of validation, stamped by clergy, which you could present back home to brag, or more importantly, to claim indulgences. The process of getting one, however, was torture. Long queues of weary pilgrims clutching their cloaks, waiting hours for some bored monk with ink-stained fingers to scrawl your name incorrectly. Lose your paper on the way home, and your months of agony were worth precisely nothing, except perhaps the fleas that came with it. Even the animals carried by pilgrims caused chaos. Chickens tied to packs clucked incessantly, attracting dogs. Sheep brought along for slaughter resisted every mile, their bleats haunting the night like woolly ghosts. Cats occasionally joined caravans, not out of piety, but because they smelled the food scraps. Of course, the cats also brought fleas, which brought plague, which made everyone cough suspiciously for the rest of the journey. Pilgrimage was supposed to be about faith, but most days it was just Noah's Ark without the organisation, or the boat. Gossip was the fuel that kept pilgrims shuffling forward when their feet wanted to give up. With nothing but mud, hunger, and lice for company, pilgrims filled the silence by dissecting each other's sins. Who was truly penitent, and who was just walking to dodge paying a debt? Which widow was secretly eyeing the monk in the corner? Which noble was rumoured to have stolen relics from another shrine? The road became a medieval rumour mill where reputations were built and destroyed between blisters, and of course the juiciest gossip always travelled faster than the healthiest pilgrim. Entire towns along the way would whisper that Brother Thomas, trudging faithfully towards Santiago, was actually expiating the sin of bedding his neighbour's goat. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the laughter, the raised eyebrows, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing someone else's suffering might be worse than yours. Meanwhile, the toll on families left behind was enormous. A peasant who set off on pilgrimage might be gone for months, even years. Fields went untilled, livestock went unfed, and debts piled up like manure outside a barn. Wives were left to fend for themselves, often forced to barter or beg, while children grew up with the kind of independence that usually ended in accidents involving farm tools. Neighbours sometimes stepped in, but not always kindly. More than one pilgrim returned home to find their house, generously, taken over by a cousin or a neighbour who decided squatters' rights were God's will. If the absent pilgrim never made it back, and plenty didn't, the family was left to guess whether they were now widows and orphans, or simply abandoned. Faith might sustain the traveller, but it rarely filled the empty larder back home. The economic impact on towns was equally messy. Pilgrims were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they brought coins, business, and a chance for locals to sell bread that should have been fed to pigs. On the other hand, they brought lice, disease, and more demand than supply. Inns overflowed, alehouses ran dry, and townspeople grew resentful of the endless tide of smelly, coughing strangers. Some towns outright banned pilgrims from entering after dark, fearing theft or outbreaks of plague. Others charged entry fees that were nothing more than glorified bribes for the gatekeeper. Towns along the busiest routes lived in a constant state of irritation, rich enough to benefit, poor enough to resent it, and always one outbreak away from wishing the whole business would collapse into the mud. Worse still, pilgrim tourism created strange black markets. Relic theft was rampant. Holy bones were stolen, chopped up and sold in smaller pieces, because why worship one saint's femur when you could buy 10 saintly finger bones at a discount? Rival churches competed to outdo each other with relics more outlandish than the last. One abbey might claim to have Christ's foreskin, while another boasted Mary's comb, and yet another displayed a vial of the Holy Spirit's breath, captured, one assumes, in a very holy bottle. Pilgrims lined up, coins in hand, too exhausted to question whether they were venerating divine artifacts or someone's laundry lint. Theft wasn't limited to relics, of course. Pilgrims stole from each other with alarming frequency. Cloaks, shoes, staffs. Anything left unattended for more than a minute was fair game. Some even disguised themselves as monks or priests to gain trust before vanishing with half a group's possessions. Communities tried to police this by demanding pilgrims travel with letters of introduction from their parish priest, but forged papers were as common as fleas. The result was a constant tension. You prayed with your companions by day, then tied your pack to your leg at night, hoping they didn't cut it loose while you slept. And then there was the strange phenomenon of pilgrim fatigue among locals. At first, towns greeted pilgrims warmly. After all, they were guests of God. But after the 100th group stumbled through with dirty feet, begging bowls and questionable hygiene, the welcome wore thin. Locals muttered curses as pilgrims clogged the streets, filled the churches and emptied the ale barrels. Some even devised cruel jokes, offering a holy shortcut that led straight into a swamp, or pointing pilgrims toward roads known for bandits. The line between hospitality and hostility blurred quickly, and every town became a gamble. Would you find a warm bed, or would you be driven out with sticks before sundown? If there was one group who truly mastered the art of pilgrimage, it wasn't the faithful, but the fakers. Beggars quickly realized that nothing made people part with their money faster than a tale of holy suffering. And what better costume than the dusty cloak and badge of a pilgrim? It was the medieval equivalent of a forged charity wristband. You wore the uniform of hardship, and coins flowed straight into your bowl. Real pilgrims trudged miles for bread crusts. Impostors strolled into towns, mumbled a half-remembered prayer, and walked away with a pocket full of alms and a belly full of stew. Some were so skilled they made an entire career out of it. They collected badges from famous shrines, not by visiting them, of course, but by stealing or buying them on the black market. With a jangling display pinned to their cloak, they looked like the medieval version of a decorated war hero, except their battles had been fought mostly against sobriety and good hygiene. They'd swan into churches boasting they had walked to Compostela 3 times, to Rome twice, and to Jerusalem once. Never mind that they got lost 3 villages over and had to ask directions to the nearest tavern. The badges were proof enough, and gullible townsfolk rushed to drop coins into their hands, hoping some of that accumulated holiness might rub off. The church tried, occasionally, to crack down on impostors. There were sermons warning against false pilgrims who took alms without ever setting foot on the sacred roads. But sermons were about as effective as telling a drunk knight to stop jousting indoors. The problem was simple. Who could tell the difference? A real pilgrim was lice-ridden, starving, and filthy. A fake pilgrim was lice-ridden, starving, and filthy. Both smelled like they'd been rolled in a pigsty. Both coughed like dying chimneys, and both had the desperate, sunken-eyed look of people who regretted every decision that brought them here. You could line them up and take bets, and half the time you'd be wrong. Some impostors took their craft to theatrical extremes. They faked injuries to seem more pitiable, wrapping bandages around perfectly healthy legs, or carrying crutches they didn't need. A particularly bold type would claim they had been miraculously healed at the last shrine, only to limp dramatically into the next town and repeat the routine. Locals ate it up, a miracle in their midst, and even if doubts crept in, no one wanted to risk being the heartless soul who ignored a holy traveller. It was emotional blackmail at its finest, centuries before Instagram influencers perfected the same art. Others simply leaned into fraud with cheerful brazenness. Imposter groups would camp outside major shrines, loudly proclaiming their holy journey while refusing to enter the actual church, since that cost money. They'd sell trinkets they claimed were blessed by saints, but were clearly scraps of wood or bent nails. Some even set up roadside stalls peddling holy water that had been scooped out of the nearest drainage ditch. The beauty of it all was that no one dared call them liars to their face, because if you insulted a supposed pilgrim, you risked insulting God. The fake pilgrims knew it, and they milked it with all the skill of seasoned conmen. For the genuine pilgrim, this was a double misery. Every time they begged for bread or asked for a bed in a barn, townsfolk rolled their eyes. Another one of those impostors, they'd mutter, slamming doors in honest faces. Real pilgrims, already starving, found themselves punished for the sins of the frauds. Trust eroded faster than their sandals. By the end of the 14th century, the reputation of pilgrims was so tattered that even the devout treated them with suspicion. To be a real pilgrim was bad enough. To be mistaken for a fake was worse. It meant you might die, not of thirst or disease, but simply of being ignored. The most successful impostors didn't just operate alone, they formed loose networks. Picture a brotherhood of frauds, swapping tips on which towns gave the most generous alms, which shrines had gullible priests, and which roads were safest for begging without actually walking anywhere. They became masters of geography, in the way only someone avoiding exercise can. They knew every shortcut, every detour, every innkeeper likely to hand out food without asking too many questions. Some even staged elaborate partnerships. One man would pretend to collapse on the roadside, writhing in false agony, while his fellow pilgrim would beg for help on his behalf. The reward was usually food, coins, or, if they played it just right, free passage in a cart while the real pilgrims kept trudging through mud. Of course, communities weren't entirely blind. Towns began developing crude tests to separate the devout from the devious. Some priests demanded pilgrims recite special prayers in Latin, a clever trick since most peasants barely knew their own names in Latin, let alone entire prayers. The problem was that real pilgrims often failed these tests too, since the average villager's literacy was about as common as indoor plumbing. Other towns asked for stamped letters from home parishes to prove authenticity, but forged letters were a thriving side hustle, written by scribes who didn't care what miracle you were faking so long as you paid in advance. The result was predictable. Impostors passed the test as often as the honest ones, leaving everyone suspicious of everyone else. Then there were the miracle testers. Some especially skeptical priests demanded proof of miracles before granting alms. "Tell us your miracle," they'd say, leaning forward eagerly. And so impostors did, with gusto. They described being cured of blindness, though suspiciously able to see the donation box, or healed of lameness while conveniently forgetting to limp on the way out. Audiences clapped, priests nodded gravely, and the frauds laughed all the way to the tavern. The absurdity reached such heights that some real pilgrims, desperate not to starve, started inventing miracle stories themselves, meaning the line between sincere devotion and shameless lying blurred until nobody could tell one from the other. Even the nobility couldn't resist the lure of fake pilgrimages. Some lords, too lazy to trudge across Europe, simply declared they'd gone in spirit. Others sent servants as proxies, outfitted with cloaks and staffs to collect badges and testimonial on their behalf. The noble stayed home, fat and comfortable, while the servant suffered the mud and the lice. When the servant returned, the lord paraded the relics and certificates as if he'd done the walking himself. His neighbours applauded his devotion, though most suspected his only true hardship was running out of imported wine one winter. In this way, pilgrimage became less about faith and more about medieval social signalling, a holy version of buying likes on social media. The fakery reached such absurd levels that it spawned a backlash in literature. Medieval satirists loved mocking false pilgrims in plays and poems, painting them as drunken rogues who wore the cloak by day, but spent their nights gambling, whoring or napping in taverns. Audiences laughed because it rang true. Everybody knew someone who had gone on pilgrimage and come back suspiciously plumper, rosier, and richer than when they left. The irony was rich. While the honest pilgrims returned home half dead, the cheats often returned looking healthier than ever, a living reminder that crime really did pay, especially if you could hum a psalm while picking pockets. By the late Middle Ages, the distrust ran so deep that towns treated all pilgrims like potential impostors. Doors slammed in faces, innkeepers demanded advance payment, and alms dried up. This only made conditions worse for the genuine faithful, who were caught in the middle of a spiritual arms race between liars and skeptics. If you were honest, you suffered twice, once on the road and again when nobody believed you. Meanwhile, the impostors adapted as impostors always do, perfecting their sad eyes, rehearsing their limp and shaking their begging bowls with the conviction of seasoned actors. Relic festivals were the medieval equivalent of a county fair, except instead of fried dough and Ferris wheels, you got bones, blood and dubious body parts on parade. Towns competed fiercely to outshine their neighbours. One might proudly unveil a genuine fragment of the True Cross, while the next claimed to have the entire True Cross, which by medieval math would have required a forest the size of France. Pilgrims flocked in droves, wallets open, desperate for a glimpse. The line between sacred ceremony and cheap sideshow blurred so badly that you could almost hear the bones rattling with laughter in their reliquaries. The festivals were carefully staged theatre. Monks processed through the streets, holding relics aloft in jewel-studded cases, chanting solemn prayers while peasants tripped over each other to touch the glass, and touch they did. Grimy hands pawing at reliquaries as if holiness could be absorbed like mud on boots. Pickpockets thrived in the crush, cutting purses while victims wept joyfully at the sight of St. Whoever's left thumb. If you managed to avoid being robbed, you still paid dearly in donations. Every relic had a price, every blessing a fee, every miracle conveniently available for a small contribution to the church roof fund. Some relics bordered on surreal. Multiple churches claimed to own Christ's foreskin, which suggests he was alarmingly well endowed, or the medieval world had a thriving market in forged genitals. Elsewhere, you might find the Virgin Mary's milk, preserved suspiciously in vials that looked like watered-down chalk. Pilgrims lined up to gape at saints' tongues, fingers, hair, and, in one particularly odd case, an entire jawbone mounted like a trophy. Towns advertised these treasures with the enthusiasm of carnival barkers. Step right up, see the miraculous toe that healed gout. And the faithful came, coughing, scratching, and clutching coins they couldn't afford to lose. The relic festivals weren't just holy showcases, they were economic engines. Merchants set up stalls selling everything from scallop shells to tin badges stamped with saintly images. Want a badge of St. James? No problem. Want 10? Even better. Buy in bulk like indulgences at a discount warehouse. Food vendors hawked overpriced bread, fish past its prime, and ale so watered down it probably counted as baptismal. Jugglers and entertainers mingled with the holy crowds, because if you couldn't be saved, you could at least be distracted. The festival atmosphere was equal parts devotion and circus, a holy pilgrimage that smelled faintly of pickled herring and manure. Competition between towns could be downright vicious. Rival churches accused each other of harbouring fake relics, while secretly commissioning their own. Entire pilgrim routes shifted depending on which shrine had the hottest miracle that year. A bone that cured blindness. Pilgrims flocked there. A cloth that raised the dead. Expect traffic jams on the muddy road for miles. It was medieval marketing at its finest, complete with hype, rivalry, and the occasional brawl when two monks from different churches tried to outshout each other about whose saint was more effective. For the weary pilgrim, it was both exhilarating and exhausting. One more spectacle to stumble through on the long, lice-ridden road to salvation. And of course, the miracles were proven by testimonies as reliable as a drunk knight's oath. A blind man claimed he could suddenly see, though he promptly tripped over a cartwheel. A paralysed woman rose from her litter, only to collapse again 2 steps later. These miracles were loudly proclaimed, repeated endlessly, and etched into the collective imagination, while skeptics stayed quiet for fear of being labelled heretics. The irony was that the loudest miracle sellers often profited the most. Faith might have been the official currency, but silver pennies were the true sacrament. Relic festivals often turned into outright miracle contests, a sort of spiritual talent show where saints competed through their bones. One shrine might boast that St. Lawrence's rib cured coughs, while another insisted that St. Agnes's veil could restore fertility. Pilgrims, desperate for results, rushed back and forth like gamblers at a racetrack, hedging their bets by touching everything within reach. It wasn't unusual for someone to stagger away claiming they'd been healed by 3 different saints in one afternoon. Whether this was divine intervention or simply the result of drinking too much of the festival ale was never clarified. The priests, of course, took it as proof of holiness, while quietly counting the clinking coins in their donation chests. With so many relics paraded about, theft was inevitable. Reliquaries disappeared under suspicious circumstances, usually during the densest crowds when everyone was too busy weeping or sneezing to notice a missing shin bone. Sometimes entire bones went missing, other times only small fragments mysteriously vanished, later reappearing at rival shrines hundreds of miles away. This created a bizarre black market where saints' body parts seemed to multiply like rabbits. One particularly absurd case involved a saint's head, which was allegedly stolen 3 separate times, resulting in 3 shrines each claiming to have the true skull. Devotees didn't seem to mind that their saint apparently had more heads than a hydra. They just kissed the reliquary and prayed for miracles anyway. The rituals pilgrims were expected to perform added another layer of misery. At certain festivals, you were required to crawl on your knees to the shrine, leaving your legs raw and bloody in the mud while monks solemnly assured you this was spiritually uplifting. Others demanded fasting, though conveniently the only food available outside the shrine gates was sold at extortionate prices by vendors who didn't seem to be fasting at all. Some shrines insisted on kissing the relic directly, which meant pressing your lips against glass already smeared with the spit of hundreds of coughing strangers. If salvation had a flavour, it was phlegm mixed with incense. And let's not forget the holy water fountains, popular fixtures at these festivals. Pilgrims lined up to drink from basins supposedly infused with saintly power. In reality, they were often just barrels of stagnant water ladled out by monks with less hygiene than the average pig farmer. People dunked their faces, washed their sores, and even filled bottles to take home, proudly showing off their miracle water. Inevitably, the water became a soup of germs, blood, and backwash, so instead of curing illness, it spread it. The irony of catching leprosy from a fountain meant to cure it was not lost on anyone, except the clergy who happily refilled it from the nearest well. The festivals also attracted sideshows that blurred the line between piety and entertainment. Jugglers, fire-eaters, and musicians joined the throng, knowing that where pilgrims gathered, coins flowed. Some towns even staged mock battles or mystery plays alongside relic displays, turning sacred festivals into sprawling carnivals of noise and spectacle. You might kneel to venerate St. Catherine's tooth one moment, then stumble outside to watch a man attempt to swallow a torch. The holy and the profane mingled so seamlessly that it was hard to tell whether you were attending a religious ceremony or a medieval circus. And of course, arguments broke out constantly. Pilgrims elbowed one another for the best spot near the reliquary. Monks from rival churches shouted over each other to declare their relics the most authentic. Even towns fought, accusing neighbours of harbouring forgeries or exaggerating miracles. To the average pilgrim, it was a spectacle of hypocrisy. Men in holy robes brawling over whose saint could vomit the most blood or whose relic glowed faintest in candlelight. Still, you dutifully shuffled forward, kissed the glass, and dropped your coin, because questioning the madness was far more dangerous than participating in it. Body part duplication was the relic world's worst-kept secret. Saints apparently had the anatomical generosity of octopuses because you could find their arms, legs, fingers, and skulls scattered across half of Europe. St. Denis, for example, somehow managed to have 3 skulls displayed in 3 different cathedrals, which made you wonder whether he'd been secretly hiding a spare head or 2 in life. Entire ribs turned up in separate reliquaries, all authentic, all miraculous, and none remotely matching in size. For pilgrims, though, this wasn't a crisis of logic. The more pieces of a saint scattered across Christendom, the better your chances of bumping into one. Holiness, after all, multiplied like rabbits in a monastery. Souvenirs became just as important as the relics themselves. Pilgrim badges stamped from tin or lead were hawked by the thousands, each depicting the shrine's saint or miracle. They were cheap, flimsy, and mass-produced, but proudly pinned to cloaks like holy merit badges. Collecting them became a sort of medieval hobby. Some pilgrims rattled with so many badges they looked like badly armoured knights. More exotic souvenirs included scraps of cloth blessed by contact with the relics, bottles of holy water, half rainwater, half mystery slime, and even contact dust swept up from around the shrine floor. People treasured these trinkets as proof they had kissed, touched, or at least sweated near holiness, while merchants smiled and stamped out another batch for the next crowd. The superstitions surrounding these festivals were terrifyingly persuasive. Miss one, and you risked divine punishment. People whispered that those who skipped a relic feast might wake up blind, infertile, or with crops mysteriously blighted. Attend one, however, and your chances of surviving childbirth, plague, or even taxation supposedly improved. Parents dragged feverish children miles just to touch a reliquary. Soldiers marched in armour to beg for protection. Peasants limped on bloody feet, convinced their souls or their potatoes depended on it. Fear kept the crowd swelling as much as faith did. After all, no one wanted to be the unlucky fool who stayed home only to discover his neighbour had attended and come back miraculously cured of gout. And the festivals weren't only about saints. Relics themselves often became the subject of bizarre rituals. In some towns, pilgrims were encouraged to circle a relic 3 times for good luck, like a medieval merry-go-round powered by desperation. Others involved crawling under altars or through special healing holes built into church walls, as if salvation could be achieved by imitating a worm. Some shrines even offered contact cures, where pilgrims rubbed their sores against reliquaries, leaving behind a sticky film of pus and hope. By the end of the day, the relics weren't just holy. They were biohazards with a prayer attached. Clergy leaned into the spectacle shamelessly. Priests narrated miracle stories with the gusto of carnival barkers, swearing that saints had just cured a woman's blindness or restored a man's hearing moments before. These claims were rarely verified, but the drama electrified the crowd. The more absurd the miracle, the bigger the donations. A child sneezed near a reliquary, clearly healed of plague. A pilgrim stumbled and fell, then stood up again. Proof the relic had strengthened his legs. Even livestock got in on the act. Tales spread of cows who gave more milk or pigs who stopped dying mysteriously after being blessed at a festival. Faith became theatre, miracles became marketing, and pilgrims became the ticket-buying audience. And yet, despite the duplications, the scams, the filthy rituals, the smell, the lies, and the sheer chaos, pilgrims still flocked. Because somewhere between the bone shards, tin badges, and miracle contests was the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, a touch, a prayer, or even a sniff of a dubious relic might mean salvation. And in a world where disease, famine, and war hovered like vultures, even the thinnest shred of hope was worth trading your last coin for. When relic festivals arrived, towns transformed overnight. What was normally a sleepy cluster of hovels in a church suddenly became a boiling cauldron of humanity. Streets clogged with pilgrims, merchants, beggars, jugglers, thieves, and livestock all jostling for space. The air thickened with incense sweat and the unmistakable perfume of overcrowded latrines. Prices for food and drink doubled instantly. A stale loaf that fed a family last week now sold for the price of a day's wages. Locals gritted their teeth, knowing the money would flow, but also knowing their streets would be left littered with bones, bottles, and enough lice to reseed the entire countryside. Festivals promised holiness, but in reality, they left behind a hangover of filth, debt, and disease. Rivalries between towns grew downright vicious. If your neighbour's relic festival attracted more pilgrims, your own coffers grew thin. So towns resorted to desperate measures, fabricating new relics, commissioning miracle stories, or even outright stealing bones from each other. Monks turned to espionage, sneaking into rival shrines at night to filch a finger or a tooth. Entire wars were fought not over land but over relics, with cities besieged to recover a saint's shin bone. Pilgrims, of course, didn't care where the bones came from, so long as they glittered in a golden case and promised miracles. But for the towns, relics were the medieval equivalent of oil, a sacred commodity worth blood, lies, and endless conflict. Inside the festival itself, the frenzy could tip into hysteria. Pilgrims sobbed, shouted, and collapsed to the ground in ecstasy. Some claimed visions, others seizures, though the line was blurry after 3 days of fasting and cheap ale. Groups whipped themselves bloody in front of the relics, convinced pain made their prayers stronger. Crowds surged so violently at times that people were trampled to death in the rush to touch a bone fragment. For every supposed miracle, there were a dozen pilgrims left limping, coughing, or bleeding in the mud, forgotten while the next miracle claimant hogged the priest's attention. If salvation looked like chaos, relic festivals were the perfect stage. The noise was relentless. Bells clanged, choirs droned, hawkers shouted about badges and holy water, and jugglers jangled their props in between. At night, when you might hope for silence, drunken pilgrims sang hymns off-key while others argued loudly about whose relic was the true relic. Sleep was impossible unless you passed out from exhaustion, and even then you risked waking to find your cloak missing and your pack rifled. For the pious, it was divine ordeal. For everyone else, it was a medieval music festival without the faintest whiff of fun. Even the relics themselves weren't always stable. Some were displayed in reliquaries so enormous and fragile that they wobbled dangerously as monks paraded them through crowds. Pilgrims reached out, desperate to touch, and reliquaries toppled, spilling teeth, ribs, or skull fragments into the mud. The scramble to grab a piece was pandemonium, men, women, and children clawing at bones like rats in a grain sack. Priests tried to restore order, but half the relics vanished into sleeves and sacks before they could be recovered. From then on, rival shrines could conveniently claim they had the authentic fragment, while the original owners insisted theirs was still genuine. It was relic duplication through clumsy disaster, and pilgrims lapped it up. Worst of all, the frenzy warped the pilgrims' minds. Some became so fixated on touching relics that they abandoned reason entirely. There are accounts of pilgrims cutting pieces from their own clothing and smearing them with pus from their wounds before pressing them against reliquaries, hoping for instant transfer of holiness. Others camped outside shrines for weeks, refusing to leave until their miracle came through, effectively squatting until monks begged them to move on. Children were sometimes thrust onto altars to be closer to God, though more often than not they came away with bruises and fleas. Faith became obsession, obsession became madness, and madness became the festival's soundtrack. Relics weren't just holy trinkets for peasants. They were political weapons. Kings and nobles hoarded them like dragons hoarded gold, each convinced that the more saintly bones in their vault, the more legitimate their reign. A reliquary wasn't just a box of dusty finger bones. It was proof that God personally endorsed your right to tax peasants until they squealed. Some rulers measured their prestige not by armies or land, but by the sheer number of jawbones and thigh bones rattling in their treasuries. Pilgrims were invited to marvel at these collections, which doubled as political propaganda. "Behold," the monarch declared, "this shinbone proves God prefers my kingdom over that other heretic's mud patch." Relic theft, therefore, became state policy. Armies didn't just march to conquer towns, they marched to loot reliquaries. Monks would discover after a siege that their cherished saint had been liberated by the enemy, carried off in triumph and locked up in some distant cathedral. These thefts were justified with the straightest of faces. The saint clearly wished to be with us, for we are more righteous. In reality, the saint's wishes had nothing to do with it, though one suspects the bones rolled their non-existent eyes each time they were kidnapped for glory. Pilgrims didn't question the change of address. They simply trudged to wherever the saint now resided, their suffering redirected like livestock on a new path. Kings went further still, commissioning outrageous relic hunts. Emissaries were dispatched across Europe with bags of silver, bribes, and the occasional dagger, returning with treasures of dubious authenticity. A nail from the true cross here, a lock of Mary's hair there, perhaps a vial of John the Baptist's breath if the merchant was particularly creative. These relics were displayed with solemn pomp, but everyone knew the game. The king's coffers might be empty, his peasants might be starving, but if he could wave around a saint's molar during Mass, the crowd would cheer. Faith was cheaper than bread, and far easier to counterfeit. Whole wars were justified in relic terms. When two kingdoms clashed, the victor often claimed it was thanks to the saintly relics in their possession. If your side lost, it was clearly because you hadn't kissed the right shinbone often enough. Armies marched into battle carrying reliquaries like talismans, convinced a bit of bone would deflect arrows more reliably than a shield. Occasionally they were paraded in front of the troops as motivation. Nothing boosts morale like watching your commander dangle the mummified finger of Saint Somebody, assuring you it guarantees victory. Naturally, arrows still flew, men still died, and the relics were often looted off the corpses afterwards. Saints, it seemed, were loyal only to the winning side. The pilgrims, of course, were pawns in this holy chess match. Whenever relics moved, they followed. One year, Compostela might be the hot destination. The next, a shinbone in Cologne drew the bigger crowds. Pilgrims trudged wherever the relics promised salvation, their misery repackaged as economic fuel for whichever kingdom owned the bones that season. Festivals swelled into propaganda rallies, where kings reminded the masses that God's favour was physically sitting in a jewel-encrusted box at their altar, not anyone else's. Pilgrims prayed, donated, and limped away poorer, while kings smiled smugly, their shrines fattened with coins and their rivals gnashing their teeth. Even popes joined the game, hoarding relics in Rome until the city resembled a celestial pawnshop. Every saint worth knowing allegedly had a body part tucked away somewhere in the papal vaults, ready to be unveiled during processions. It was an arms race of sanctity, a desperate attempt to prove that one city was more beloved by God than all others. Pilgrims, crushed in crowds and coughing in incense smoke, didn't know whether to be awestruck or faint from exhaustion. Either way, the result was the same. More coins dropped into the coffers, more badges pinned to cloaks, and more peasants stumbling back onto the road, half convinced they had glimpsed heaven through a haze of dust and marketing. Relics didn't just sit quietly in their golden boxes, they built economies. A town lucky enough to snag a saint's body part transformed overnight. What had been a sleepy cluster of hovels became a bustling, holy destination, complete with inns, taverns, markets, and endless ways to separate pilgrims from their coins. Merchants sprang up like mushrooms after rain, flogging everything from scallop shells to miracle ointments that were suspiciously indistinguishable from pig fat. A shinbone could mean the difference between a town starving in obscurity or thriving on a steady diet of gullible strangers. Saints, in short, were the original tourism industry, except they didn't need to eat or drink, only to lie politely in their reliquary while the money rolled in. Entire civic budgets depended on bones. Councils raised taxes to gild reliquaries, hired masons to build bigger churches, and paved streets. Not for the locals, of course, but for the swarms of visitors who otherwise might trip and decide to leave their coins elsewhere. It was a medieval arms race of infrastructure. If your neighbour's shrine had a fancy new cloister, you scrambled to add stained glass. If they hired choirs, you hired bigger choirs. The irony was delicious. The holier the relic, the less holy the behaviour surrounding it, as towns bankrupted themselves competing to host the flashiest festival, while peasants starved quietly in the fields outside. Pilgrims themselves became a kind of currency. A town's prestige was measured not by crops or trade, but by the sheer volume of foot traffic limping down its streets. Guides were dispatched to counter rivals, exaggerating numbers wildly to brag about 10,000 pilgrims this year, when in reality the crowd barely reached a few hundred. Monarchs listened closely, because where pilgrims gathered, coin flowed. Taxes were levied on markets, tolls on bridges, and pilgrim fees at town gates. The faithful, hungry and broke, didn't see themselves as currency, but everyone else did. Each lice-ridden body trudging through town was one more coin for the coffers, one more excuse for officials to claim divine prosperity. Of course, when relics moved, economies collapsed. A bone stolen or transferred to another shrine spelled disaster. Towns that had thrived on pilgrim trade suddenly faced empty streets, abandoned inns and merchants glaring at dusty shelves of unsold trinkets. Desperate towns sometimes invented relics to fill the gap. Suddenly a mysterious vision revealed that since somebody's toenail had been buried under the local well all along, the people rejoiced. The priest staged a dramatic discovery, and trade returned, at least until someone pointed out the same saint's toenail was already on display in 3 other towns. Authenticity mattered less than spectacle, and towns were more than willing to lie if it meant keeping their markets alive. The economics extended to relic guardians too. Monks charged for access, for touching, even for looking. Pilgrims might shuffle for hours in a line, only to discover a fee was required to enter the shrine itself. Couldn't pay? You could settle for kneeling outside and listening to muffled chanting. Inside, wealthy patrons got the front row, peasants were crammed into corners, and both groups left lighter in purse but heavier in the conviction they had glimpsed eternity. Some monks even offered premium services, like pressing a relic directly against your forehead, for a price, naturally. Salvation had become tiered seating, a spiritual economy that rivaled the modern stadium, and all the while pilgrims bore the brunt. Their wages, savings and dignity evaporated into town coffers, their bodies used as fuel for an industry built on bones. They trudged away with badges pinned to cloaks and empty bellies, convinced they had invested in eternal security. For the towns, however, the relic game was brutally practical. Keep the bones polished, keep the stories outrageous, and keep the pilgrims coming. Holiness might have been the selling point, but economics was the true miracle worker. Souvenirs were the bread and butter of relic culture, the medieval version of plastic Eiffel Towers and I Heart and Why mugs. Pilgrim badges stamped out of cheap tin were churned by the thousands. They bent, snapped, and rusted within weeks, but pilgrims wore them proudly as proof of holy suffering. Some wore so many that their cloaks jingled like wind chimes, each badge a noisy testament to the fact that they'd survived dysentery long enough to reach another shrine. Beyond badges there were relic-adjacent knickknacks, splinters of contact wood rubbed against a reliquary, scraps of cloth brushed over a saint's skull, or holy dirt scooped up from the shrine floor and sold in tiny pouches. By the time you returned home, your sack clattered with trinkets worth less than the lice chewing on your scalp. Miracle tourism was another flourishing side industry. Relics were advertised the way seaside resorts are today. Monks proclaimed healings in dramatic detail. Blindness cured, wounds closed, infertile women suddenly fertile again. Town criers spread the news across the countryside. Come to St. Somebody's shinbone this summer, guaranteed miracles or your coin back, but actually no refunds. Pilgrims planned their journeys around these miracle hotspots, convinced the right relic could solve their problems. The sickest dragged themselves for miles, carried in litters, or shoved along in carts, hoping for a cure that usually turned out to be wishful thinking mixed with placebo. When nothing changed, they were told the fault was theirs. Not enough faith, not enough fasting, or perhaps God just enjoyed watching them limp. Scams flourished alongside the miracles. Crooked vendors claimed to sell genuine relic shards, usually chipped off an old femur stolen from the local graveyard. Holy oil was sold by the flask, but more often than not it was just animal fat mixed with herbs that made you smell like stew. Priests sometimes doubled as conmen, charging pilgrims for exclusive blessings, or offering prayers in exchange for coins slipped discreetly into their sleeves. The most ruthless scams preyed on desperation. Miracle cures for children, special blessings for dying parents, promises of safety from plague, all available for the right donation. Families spent their last coins on promises, then trudged home poorer, still coughing and with nothing to show for it but a badge and the gnawing suspicion they'd been duped. Some of the most absurd souvenirs were body part themed. Churches sold miniature reliquaries shaped like the very bones they housed. Tiny tin skulls, ribs, or hands, complete with inscriptions declaring them authentic. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a toy sword after visiting a castle. Pilgrims paraded them proudly, ignoring the fact that every other peasant in the village had the exact same mass-produced trinket. A few shrines even bottled saintly breath, really just air trapped in vials, which could be purchased to bless homes, livestock, or unlucky neighbours. It didn't work, of course, but it made a fine story, and stories were often more valuable than the object itself. The scams reached their most shameless form with itinerant relic sellers. These were men who wandered from town to town with wagons loaded with bones, teeth, and wood scraps, loudly declaring them holy. They waved skulls aloft, insisting this one cured gout, that one guaranteed safe childbirth, and the other was best for warding off demons in the privy. Villagers bought eagerly, and the sellers moved on before anyone noticed the demons remained. The gout worsened, and the skull looked suspiciously like it once belonged to a cow. The church denounced them, of course, but often only after pocketing a cut of the sales. And yet, despite the obvious fakery, the trade thrived because it wasn't really about truth. It was about hope. Pilgrims returned home and displayed their trinkets proudly, weaving tales of the relics they had seen and the miracles they had brushed against. Families gathered to hear the stories, touch the badges, and convince themselves that the trip had been worth it. The relic economy didn't rely on miracles actually happening. It relied on people wanting so badly to believe that they ignored the stink of fraud. Faith, commerce, and gullibility made a potent cocktail, and towns, priests and peddlers kept pouring. When pilgrims staggered home, they didn't just carry lice and dysentery, they carried relic fever. Souvenirs, however cheap, became trophies, displayed like war medals. A scallop shell from Santiago was pinned proudly to a cloak, as though surviving blisters counted as divine valour. Tin badges clinked like noisy armour, and neighbours gathered to gape, half impressed, half sceptical. The more badges you wore, the holier you appeared, though most suspected it just meant you'd been fleeced by more roadside hawkers than the next man. Returning pilgrims basked in this uneasy admiration, happy to forget that the only miracle they'd truly experienced was not dying in a ditch. Back home, relic souvenirs seeped into daily rituals. Pilgrims pressed scraps of cloth that had brushed a saint's shin bone against their livestock, hoping it would stop cows from dying inconveniently in winter. Holy water was sprinkled over gardens to bless the cabbages, though more often it blessed them with a sudden outbreak of mould. Tin badges were nailed above doorways to ward off evil, which did nothing about thieves but did make cottages look like badly decorated shrines. The objects themselves were worthless, but the stories wrapped around them were priceless. Pilgrims became local celebrities, recounting every blister and miracle to bored neighbours who nodded politely while wondering if the badge was worth pawning. Some families went further, building miniature shrines in their cottages. A shelf became an altar, cluttered with vials of holy dust, scraps of parchment bearing prayers, and badges arranged like a saintly collage. Visitors were encouraged to kiss the items, and sometimes coins were slipped into little bowls, transforming homes into cottage industries of holiness. It was a clever way to turn the prestige of a pilgrimage into long-term profit. Yes, my husband nearly died of dysentery, but now we have a relic corner. Would you like to donate? Faith became franchise, a McShrine in every village, staffed by peasants who knew a good racket when they saw one. Social status was reshaped by pilgrimage. A peasant who had walked to Compostela suddenly ranked above neighbours who had never left the village. Bragging rights mattered. I kissed St. James's relic carried more weight than I harvested my turnips early. Marriage prospects improved if you had been on pilgrimage, because holiness supposedly rubbed off in bed as well as in church. The irony, of course, was that most returning pilgrims were too exhausted, scarred, or diseased to enjoy their new prestige. Still, the badge pinned to their cloak was proof enough, a shining, tin-covered lie that elevated them above their equally miserable neighbours. And then came the jealousies. Not everyone could afford a pilgrimage, and resentment simmered. Villagers who had stayed behind mocked returning pilgrims as gullible fools who wasted their coin on trinkets and lies. At the same time, they envied the status the badges brought, muttering curses while secretly wishing they had one pinned to their own cloaks. The tension created a social divide, those who had trudged the holy roads and those who hadn't. Both groups scowled at each other, convinced the other had chosen the wrong form of misery. It was less about salvation and more about one-upmanship, a holy arms race fought with badges and blisters. The obsession even shaped wills and inheritances. Pilgrims often left souvenirs to heirs, convinced a badge or vial of water would protect a family line for generations. Entire chests were filled with tin trinkets passed down like family jewels. Though anyone with eyes could see they were more rust than silver, still they were treasured, kissed, and sworn over in oaths. A relic touched a shrine, the thinking went, therefore it carried a shard of holiness forever. In reality, it carried a shard of medieval commerce, but when eternity was on the line, nobody wanted to look too closely. Pilgrimage prestige didn't just elevate, it divided. Communities turned into petty battlegrounds of holiness, with villagers locked in contests over who had the more authentic badge, the grander miracle tale, or the most dramatic scar from the journey. One pilgrim might swear he drank from the very well where St. James once spat, while another insisted she saw the Virgin herself hovering above the reliquary. These arguments could drag on for years, punctuated by muttered insults at market stalls. "Oh yes, Thomas says his badge is real, but I hear he bought it second-hand off a drunk monk in Rouen." Salvation, it seemed, didn't stop gossip, it fertilized it. Of course, where prestige exists, fakery follows. Villagers who never left their fields sometimes faked their way into the holy elite. Tin badges could be stolen, bought from itinerant traders, or simply cobbled together at home with a bit of melted scrap metal. Suddenly, a man who had never walked beyond the parish boundary was boasting of kissing relics in Compostela. The stories were harder to fake, but imagination filled the gaps. Yes, I saw miracles, but they were too holy for words. Suspicion simmered, but who dared challenge a claim wrapped in piety? Better to nod politely than risk being branded the skeptic who mocked God. Rivalries escalated into absurdity. Families hoarded their pilgrimage souvenirs like heirlooms, parading them at feasts while subtly undermining others. "Oh, your badge is lovely," a neighbour might say sweetly, "but ours was blessed by the bishop himself." Of course, not everyone can afford real miracles. Children were dragged into the rivalry, forced to repeat their parents' miracle tales in public, turning holy experiences into competitive bedtime stories. Soon, villages were less concerned with faith than with keeping up with the relic-rich Joneses next door. A pilgrimage wasn't just penance, it was social climbing disguised as blistered feet. Some communities even turned pilgrimage tales into currency of influence. A returning pilgrim might suddenly find himself elected to local councils, not because he was wise or capable, but because he had supposedly brushed against holiness. His opinion on crops or taxes carried divine weight, even if his only expertise was which ditch was best for sleeping in along the French roads. Others parlayed their stories into marriage alliances. Nothing says trustworthy husband like surviving a trip where half your companions died of dysentery. Faith became a resume line, a divine qualification that excused mediocrity everywhere else. The fraud grew so pervasive that clergy occasionally intervened, demanding proof of actual travel. Testimonia, stamped letters from major shrines, became prized documents, flaunted like medieval passports. But even these were faked, forged by scribes who happily copied the seals for a few pennies. The result? Villages filled with pilgrims who couldn't agree on which stories were true, which badges were real, or which miracles actually happened. But the arguments themselves became the point. In a life filled with ploughing, hunger, and disease, bickering about shin bones and scallop shells was a distraction, one that kept villagers entertained long after the lice had stopped itching. Rivalries didn't stay confined to villages, they ballooned into regional feuds. Neighbouring towns bickered endlessly over whose relics drew more pilgrims, whose saints were more effective, and whose miracles were properly verified. A festival in one town would claim that St. Michael had healed 3 paralytics in a single afternoon, while the town down the road countered with St. Catherine's veil, which allegedly saved an entire field of barley from blight. Naturally, both towns accused the other of lying, and both were right. Pilgrims became pawns in these rivalries, herded from one overblown spectacle to another, with each side shrieking that their relics were holier. It wasn't so much faith as marketing. Medieval advertising wars fought with bones instead of billboards. Out of this competitive frenzy grew outright frauds that blossomed into cults of their own. Enter the miracle entrepreneurs, clergy or enterprising townsfolk who staged wonders to attract pilgrims. They'd place a blind man near the shrine, who miraculously regained sight after touching the relic, only to turn up blind again at the next town's festival, ready for an encore performance. Priests whispered of relics that glowed faintly at night, Never mind that they had been rubbing them with phosphorescent fish oil. Others swore the bones dripped holy oil or blood, though the stains looked suspiciously like rust or pig's blood smeared artfully before dawn. Gullible crowds gasped, coins clattered into coffers, and the miracle cult was born. Once a miracle caught on, it spread like wildfire. Pilgrims repeated the stories at every stop, and before long the fraud was immortalized as holy fact. Some communities, too impatient to wait for genuine relics, simply invented holy sites from thin air. A farmer ploughing his field might declare he saw a vision of the Virgin in the dust. A shepherd claimed his sheep bowed to a stone, which was then declared sacred. Priests hurried in, built chapels around these miracles, and within months, a trickle of pilgrims became a flood. Whole villages rebranded themselves as centres of holiness based on nothing more than a rumour and a few dramatic gestures at the right moment. It was economic opportunism wrapped in incense. Whether or not saints had ever set foot there mattered little. What mattered was that pilgrims did, dropping coins as they stumbled towards salvation. These fabricated sites sparked even bigger rivalries. Established shrines fumed when some upstart village claimed their puddle cured gout, or their rock whispered prayers at midnight. Angry letters were dispatched to bishops demanding investigations. But the investigations rarely resolved anything. Every bishop had his own stake in the relic business, and a new shrine meant new revenue streams. Some towns even competed to produce more dramatic visions, each trying to outdo the last. You saw Mary? Well, we saw her riding a white horse through our fields. Faith became a medieval arms race of spectacle, with miracles inflated until they bordered on parody. The pilgrims, meanwhile, didn't question much. They were too tired, too desperate, and too hopeful. If a town claimed its relic sweat blood once a year, people came in droves to watch, never mind that the blood looked remarkably like dye smeared onto linen. If a shepherd swore he heard angels singing above a shrine, crowds gathered eagerly, ignoring the suspiciously hidden choir behind the chapel wall. Pilgrims accepted these spectacles because not believing them was worse. Doubt meant despair, and despair meant admitting you had walked hundreds of miles for nothing but a handful of tin badges and stale bread. Belief, however absurd, was the only way to salvage the misery. When miracle cults spiraled too far, they often tipped into violence. Picture a mob of exhausted, half-starved pilgrims crammed into a square, all clawing for the chance to touch a relic dangled overhead. Piety melted into fury the moment someone cut in line. Shoving turned to fists, fists turned to knives, and before long the holy festival resembled a tavern brawl with incense. Monks tried to calm the crowd with hymns, but nothing cools tempers like being elbowed in the ribs while a rival pilgrim presses his lips against the relic first. Riots broke out not just between individuals but whole groups, rival pilgrim companies chanting their saints' names like medieval football hooligans. The disputes didn't always end in the mud. Sometimes they escalated to lawsuits. Towns dragged each other before bishops or even popes, hurling accusations of relic theft, forgery, or false miracles. The hearings read like grotesque comedy, monks swearing oaths that their skull was the one true skull of St. Denis, while their rivals produced witnesses equally certain theirs was genuine. The judges, often as corrupt as the claimants, ruled based on which side offered the fatter purse. Pilgrims rarely cared about the verdict. They were too busy watching the circus and wondering if maybe they should buy a few splinters, just in case. Sometimes disputes leapt out of courts and into the streets. Whole towns rioted over relic ownership. One infamous case saw citizens storm a church, seize a reliquary, and march it triumphantly to their own parish, declaring that the saint had chosen them. The losing side pursued, fists flying, women screaming, children throwing stones, until the reliquary was dented, bloodied, and smeared with mud, all while the bones inside rattled silently, surely wondering how they had ended up in the middle of a brawl centuries after death. These were not rare events. They were practically a feature of relic culture, as common as blisters on a pilgrim's feet. Rival shrines even used violence as marketing. One church would hire guards to protect its relics, loudly warning pilgrims that heretics were plotting theft. Another would announce that their relic had survived 3 armed raids, which only proved how miraculous it was. Pilgrims, gullible and desperate, flocked to whichever shrine sounded most embattled, eager to be part of the drama. Faith thrived on spectacle, and nothing was more spectacular than monks swinging clubs at rivals while parishioners cheered them on. It was the Middle Ages version of reality TV, except the stakes were holy bones instead of bad singing careers. The irony was that saints, meant to embody peace and piety, became the most fought-over corpses in Christendom. Towns waged mini-wars over shin bones and finger bones, kings funded raids to capture skulls, and peasants battered each other senseless for the right to kiss a bit of cartilage. The church insisted these relics brought unity and salvation, but anyone watching the bruised crowds staggering from festivals could see otherwise. Relics united people only in chaos, in shouting, in coins flying from purses, and in the knowledge that if holiness existed, it was hidden somewhere under the blood, mud, and broken noses left behind in the square. Relic politics didn't stop at town borders. They spilled into crusades and international rivalries, where saints' bones were treated like diplomatic currency. Kings waved relics before their troops as if they were divine insurance policies, promising victory so long as the soldiers marched behind the right shin bone. Crusader armies lugged reliquaries across deserts, sweating under the weight of jewel-encrusted boxes while men collapsed from thirst. The irony was staggering. Water was scarce, but somehow there was always room in the baggage train for yet another saint's jaw. If the relics actually guaranteed victory, one wonders how the Crusaders lost so often. Perhaps the saints were simply tired of being carted around like military mascots. Relics also served as spoils of war. A victorious army might plunder a rival cathedral, parading stolen bones through the streets as proof that God had switched allegiances. These parades were less about holiness than humiliation. Nothing rubbed salt in a loser's wound like watching his patron saint's skull wobbling on a stick in enemy hands. Towns treated these relics like hostages, boasting of their capture and daring rivals to try reclaiming them. It was ransom politics with a holy veneer, bones traded like poker chips in a game of divine bluff. The saints, silent and brittle, were reduced to bargaining tools in the grubby squabbles of men who pretended to act in God's name. The papacy got in on the act too, hoarding relics in Rome like an arms dealer stockpiling weapons. Popes deployed relics as diplomatic gifts, sending splinters of the true cross or vials of saintly dust to curry favour with kings. These weren't humble tokens, they were political bribes, offered with the same gravity as treaties. Support our crusade, a pope might say, and here's St. Andrew's finger for your treasury. The kings naturally displayed these bones in gleaming reliquaries, announcing to their subjects that God himself endorsed their rule. The bones didn't speak, but the message was loud enough. Loyalty was measured not in armies or coin, but in the number of corpses your church vault could boast. International rivalries grew absurd. France and England bickered not only over land, but over relic authenticity. Each insisted their saints were the holiest, their miracles the most spectacular, and their bones the most genuine. Pilgrims were caught in the middle, urged to travel across borders to prove their loyalty by kissing French relics or English ones, depending on where their allegiance and coin lay. Even the Byzantines and Western Europeans fought over relics, with Constantinople's vast treasury looted during the Fourth Crusade in a frenzy of bone-snatching. Ships carried skulls, femurs, and shreds of cloth back to the west, where they were triumphantly displayed as proof of God's will. Never mind that they had been ripped from churches while priests screamed. Holiness, in the end, looked remarkably like armed robbery. Relics were even invoked to justify entire campaigns. A missing saint might be declared in peril, and suddenly an army was raised to rescue it. Wars that had more to do with trade routes and taxes were rebranded as holy missions to save a skull or femur. The soldiers trudging off to die rarely saw the relic in question. It sat safely in a treasury, while their blood fertilized the fields. For rulers, relics were perfect propaganda. No one argued with bones. You could stir peasants to war faster with a waving reliquary than with 100 decrees about tariffs. And so the cycle continued. Armies marched, saints were kidnapped, and Europe rattled endlessly with the clamour of men killing one another for bones that never once asked to be fought over. Among the nobility, relics became the ultimate status symbol. Forget castles or fine horses. Anyone with coin could buy those, but a reliquary crammed with a saint's molar, that was social capital you couldn't fake. Noble families collected relics the way modern collectors hoard rare art, displaying them at banquets like conversation pieces. Guests were ushered into private chapels not to pray but to gawk at gilded boxes filled with dubious bone fragments. "Here lies St. Bartholomew's finger," the host would announce, puffed with pride, while everyone pretended not to notice that 3 other barons claimed the exact same digit. Owning a relic didn't just prove piety, it screamed, "God himself attends my dinner parties." These private collections were less about holiness and more about spectacle. Noblemen bragged about the sheer variety of their treasures, arranging them in shrines like medieval cabinets of curiosities. One might boast of a saint's rib, another of a vial of the Virgin's milk, and another of a feather from the Holy Spirit's dove, which, oddly, looked a great deal like a goose feather plucked on short notice. Visitors were expected to gasp reverently, and if they didn't, they risked offending both their host and, by extension, heaven. The more ludicrous the relic, the more awe it commanded. To question was to blaspheme, and blasphemers rarely made it home with their tongues intact. Relics were also weapons of aristocratic rivalry. Kings exchanged them as gifts, not out of generosity, but to one-up each other in the eternal competition for divine approval. A duke might flaunt a reliquary stuffed with 3 saintly fingers, only to be humiliated when his neighbour unveiled a whole arm. A queen's dowry might include a skull or shin bone, ensuring her new household had not just a bride but a portable shrine. Even weddings became stages for relic displays. Imagine lifting your veil while your in-laws bragged about the jawbone of St. Stephen tucked safely in the family treasury. Holiness and social climbing merged seamlessly, leaving little doubt about where priorities lay. For ordinary pilgrims allowed a glimpse of these collections, the effect was dazzling and devastating. Villagers who had trudged hundreds of miles to kiss one relic suddenly found themselves surrounded by dozens, even hundreds, glittering in candlelight. Awe turned quickly to envy. "Why does my lord have a saint's hand?" they muttered, "while my pilgrimage earned me a rusty tin badge?" The spectacle reinforced the cosmic hierarchy. The rich owned holiness in bulk, while the poor queued endlessly for a chance to touch one's sweaty reliquary in a crowded chapel. Faith was universal, but access was priced according to rank. Naturally, the more relics nobles flaunted, the more doubt spread among common folk. Whispers grew. How could so many bones of the same saint exist in so many places? How did every cathedral claim to own a sliver of the true cross large enough to rebuild Noah's Ark? Yet to speak such questions aloud was dangerous. Better to mutter suspicions in barns and taverns, where disbelief could be disguised as drunken rambling. Nobles, meanwhile, ignored the murmurs, knowing that power wasn't about truth but performance. If their reliquary glittered and pilgrims gasped, the relic had done its job, whether or not the bone inside belonged to a saint, a soldier, or last week's supper goose. Relics were never content to sit quietly in chapels. They seeped into daily life like holy mould. A fragment of bone wasn't just a token of piety. It was a cure-all, a charm, and a bargaining chip. Ground into powder, relic fragments were slipped into drinks as medicine, mixed with honey or wine to purify the humours. Doctors, or what passed for them, prescribed relic scrapings for everything from toothache to plague, assuring patients that swallowing dust from St. Augustine's elbow was bound to work better than bleeding them half to death. Whether the patient recovered or not hardly mattered. If they survived, it was a miracle, and if they died, well, clearly they lacked faith. Either way, the relic's reputation remained spotless. Relics also entered the world of law. Oaths sworn over a reliquary carried more weight than parchment or seal. A peasant might be dragged before a relic and told to swear he hadn't stolen his neighbour's pig. If he lied, it was believed the saint would strike him down on the spot. In practice, it simply meant he lied with extra conviction, while everyone else nodded solemnly and pretended to feel a chill in the air. Kings, too, swore treaties over relics, parading them before ambassadors as if a saint's femur would keep them honest. Naturally, treaties collapsed within months, but nobody blamed the relic. The bones were innocent. It was always the humans who were disappointingly corrupt. Weather control was another absurd role foisted onto relics. Drought. Carry the reliquary into the fields and pray for rain. Flood. Hoist the same relic and beg it to stop. If the weather changed, it was a miracle. If it didn't, clearly the villagers hadn't prayed hard enough. Some communities even organised processions, parading bones through muddy lanes like divine scarecrows meant to frighten the skies into cooperation. Entire harvests were blamed on relics. A bumper crop was proof of saintly favour. while famine meant the relic had been neglected, or worse, insulted. It was theology by barometer, where saints doubled as celestial farmers with a bone to pick. Farmers, in particular, folded relics into every stage of their work. A scrap of cloth blessed by a shrine might be tied to a plough for good luck. A saint's finger bone, if you were rich enough to borrow one, could be waved over seed sacks before planting. Some even pushed relics into furrows as if saints could sprout along with wheat. Animals, too, were drafted into the cult. Cows sprinkled with holy water, chickens brushed with pilgrim badges, sheep herded past reliquaries in hopes of avoiding disease. When livestock inevitably died anyway, it was chalked up not to poor husbandry but to divine mystery, and the cycle of relic devotion rolled on. Even childbirth was tangled up in relic superstition. Expectant mothers clutched holy badges or pressed blessed cloths to their bellies, convinced that saints would smooth the perilous process. Relics were placed under pillows, worn around necks, or hung in doorways to keep out devils who supposedly lurked nearby with a taste for newborns. If the birth went well, the saint got credit. If it went badly, the midwife was blamed, or the family was scolded for not donating enough to the shrine. It was a rigged system. The relics always won, while mortals picked up the bill and the corpses. And then there was relic tourism in its most mundane form, borrowing. Families would petition monasteries to loan out relics for special needs. A reliquary might make a guest appearance at a plague-stricken village, wheeled in with solemn pomp like a celebrity cameo. Villagers prayed, coins changed hands, and then the relic was whisked back home before anyone noticed the plague hadn't improved. Some relics were in such high demand they practically went on tour, carted from town to town like medieval rock stars with worse hygiene. And everywhere they went the story was the same: ore, prayer, coin, disappointment, repeat. On the battlefield, relics were treated like secret weapons, hauled out in the belief that a saint's shinbone could deflect arrows better than a shield. Priests paraded them in front of troops, chanting blessings while soldiers kissed the reliquaries before charging into certain death. In theory, the relics guaranteed victory. In practice, the side with more soldiers, sharper swords, and less dysentery usually won. But after the carnage, survivors insisted it was the relic that had protected them, not the fact that they'd been standing behind someone fatter when the arrows flew. Relics even rode into sieges, held aloft on city walls to terrify besiegers with the saintly stare of a centuries-old skull. Did it stop trebuchet stones? Number. But it gave everyone something to look at while the walls crumbled. Relics also crept into the courtroom, where they served as props in criminal trials. Suspects were forced to touch bones or kiss reliquaries while proclaiming their innocence. If they trembled, it was proof of guilt. If they stayed calm, clearly the saint was watching over them. Of course, seasoned criminals quickly learned to keep a straight face, and nervous peasants sweated buckets even when innocent. Some courts took it further, staging ordeals where relics were part of the test, like swearing over a relic before plunging a hand into boiling water to prove one's truthfulness. If the wound healed clean, the relic had vouched for you. If it festered, congratulations, you were guilty. Saints' bones thus became silent jurors, consulted more often than actual evidence, which was scarce in a world where literacy was already a miracle. Then there were relics so bizarre they made even the faithful blink. The foreskins of Christ, plural because apparently one wasn't enough, were claimed by multiple churches, each swearing theirs was genuine. Several towns boasted vials of Mary's milk, still fresh after a millennium, though suspiciously chalky and sometimes sour. One shrine claimed to own feathers from the Holy Spirit's dove, which bore an uncanny resemblance to barnyard goose fluff. Others displayed everything from saintly fingernails to drops of Jesus' sweat, bottled with all the reverence of vintage wine. The sheer proliferation of body parts implied that saints were not so much human as endlessly divisible carcasses, parcelled out like cuts at a butcher's shop. Not all relics were bodily, of course. Some were stranger still: shreds of the burning bush, sand from the desert where Christ fasted, even the rope Judas allegedly used to hang himself. Pilgrims venerated these items as though proximity to tragedy somehow made them holy. Churches boasted of entire wardrobes of Christ, with multiple tunics on display in different countries, none agreeing on the size. The duplication was so flagrant it would have been funny, and indeed satirists mocked it relentlessly. Yet the crowds kept coming. Faith wasn't about logic, it was about spectacle. and nothing was more spectacular than a golden box filled with something that shouldn't exist but did because someone said so loudly enough. The bizarreness reached its height with relic multiplication. One saint's head might be venerated in 5 towns simultaneously, each insisting theirs was authentic. Splinters of the true cross were so plentiful that critics joked you could rebuild Noah's Ark twice over, yet the faithful didn't mind. If anything, the abundance was spun as proof of God's generosity. There were enough holy bones for everyone. Pilgrims clutched their trinkets, kissed their relics, and reassured themselves that salvation had been democratized. Even if, behind the glittering reliquaries, priests laughed all the way to the treasury. By the late Middle Ages, even the faithful began to squint at the reliquaries and wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, they were being played. After all, how many foreskins of Christ could one Saviour reasonably have? How many skulls could St. Denny misplace before people stopped calling him a martyr and started calling him a hydra? Pilgrims whispered their doubts in taverns, careful not to speak too loudly. Heresy charges had a way of ruining a perfectly good evening. But the seed of suspicion grew, watered by the sheer ridiculousness of the relic trade. Faith could stomach hardship, filth, and famine, but it struggled with the sight of 3 separate churches claiming to own the exact same jawbone. Writers and reformers were the first to sharpen their knives. Satirists mocked the relic craze in poems and plays, portraying gullible pilgrims as wide-eyed fools fleeced by cunning monks. Preachers thundered against fake miracles, denouncing relic hawkers as conmen in holy robes. Even church insiders admitted things had gotten out of hand. Erasmus famously sneered at the ridiculous trinkets sold as sacred, noting that if every splinter of the true cross were genuine, it would furnish enough lumber for a fleet of ships. These criticisms struck nerves because they weren't wrong. Everyone knew the relic economy was bloated with fraud. It was simply easier and safer to ignore it until someone brave enough forced the issue. The Reformation turned that simmering doubt into open rebellion. Martin Luther derided relics as spiritual snake oil, pointing out that salvation by shinbone was a poor substitute for Scripture. Protestant reformers tore into the trade with relish, burning relics, smashing reliquaries, and laughing at the absurdity of bones passed off as holy. They accused the Catholic Church of exploiting fear and desperation, turning salvation into a marketplace transaction. For many peasants, who had emptied their purses for badges and blessings only to return home just as sick and hungry, the critique struck like lightning. The relic cult had overplayed its hand, and the cracks were impossible to plaster over with another miracle story. Even within Catholic ranks, reform took hold. The Council of Trent eventually tightened the rules, demanding that relics be authenticated and displayed with more restraint. It was an admission, however grudging, that the market had been flooded with fakes, frauds, and farce, yet the damage was done. Once mocked as laughable, relics could never fully regain their sheen. The carnival atmosphere of the festivals dulled, the wildest miracle claims hushed, and the relic trade limped into a quieter, more carefully managed existence. Faith endured, but the unbridled chaos, the riots, the duplications, the bizarre relic tours, slowly lost momentum, and yet the hunger for relics never vanished entirely. Even skeptics admitted there was something magnetic about a glittering reliquary, about the idea that divinity could be housed in bone and dust. Pilgrims still came, though fewer in number, and towns still guarded their relics fiercely. The difference was tone. What had once been shouted from pulpits and marketplaces was now whispered more cautiously, wrapped in the trappings of ceremony instead of spectacle. The relic cult had survived, but only by shrinking, by retreating from absurdity into solemnity, though anyone with a sharp eye could still see the cracks in the gilding. When the fires of reform cooled, relics didn't vanish, they adapted. The Church, bruised by criticism, tucked them behind layers of ritual and ceremony, presenting them less as carnival attractions and more as solemn treasures. What once rattled down muddy pilgrim roads in dented reliquaries was now displayed in carefully guarded chapels, behind velvet ropes of liturgy and incense. The bones hadn't changed, only the marketing had. Pilgrims were fewer, quieter, and more cautious, but still they came. After centuries of chaos, relics survived not by shouting miracles but by whispering dignity. Nations too recognized their value. Relics became more than holy trinkets. They became symbols of identity, pieces of divine legitimacy locked into crowns and constitutions. A country that boasted the skull of a saint could claim heaven's blessing in ways that treaties and armies never could. Kings paraded reliquaries during coronations. Generals invoked them in speeches. These bones, once fought over in muddy riots, were now polished into state treasures, displayed with reverence in cathedrals that doubled as national museums. Faith remained the wrapping paper, but underneath, relics were power objects, tools of unity, propaganda, and above all pride. Private collections endured as well, though the swagger softened. Aristocrats still filled chapels with relic cabinets, but the tone shifted from spectacle to heritage. Families displayed reliquaries as heirlooms, proof that their ancestors had marched in crusades or hobnobbed with bishops. Some were authentic, many weren't, but truth was less important than prestige. To own a relic was still to own a slice of heaven, or at least the appearance of it. The wealthy clung to them, not with the wild fervour of medieval festivals, but with the calm smugness of people who knew their bones glittered brighter than the neighbours'. And relic devotion, while tamed, never truly died out. Festivals were quieter but not extinct. Processions still paraded bones through city streets, albeit with more order and fewer fistfights. Pilgrims still kissed reliquaries, though now under the careful gaze of priests who wiped the glass clean between each supplicant. Even the miracle stories persisted, though retold with a wink, framed as legends, not guarantees. The absurdity had been sanded down, but the bones still had their pull. A relic didn't need to cure blindness anymore. It only needed to look impressive under candlelight and remind the faithful of continuity in a fractured world. Echoes of the old madness linger even today. Tourists queue in cathedrals to gawk at skulls in gilded boxes, not so different from their medieval ancestors. Museums display splinters of the true cross, or shreds of saintly robes with placards instead of miracle claims. But the effect is the same. Reverence mixed with skepticism, fascination edged with doubt. People still cross themselves, whisper prayers or drop coins in boxes, even as they chuckle at the sheer improbability of it all. The relic trade may have lost its carnival barkers and miracle contests, but its skeleton, quite literally, remains intact, rattling faintly in the glass cases of churches and museums alike. Today, relics sit under glass like retired celebrities, stripped of their medieval carnival atmosphere but still drawing crowds. Pilgrims have been replaced by tourists in baseball caps, who shuffle into cathedrals with guidebooks and smartphones, snapping photos of bones once paraded through muddy streets. The miracle stories are gone from the official brochures, replaced by words like heritage and culture. But the awe lingers in the hushed tones, the craned necks, the respectful silence. It's a new kind of devotion, not the desperate prayers of a peasant begging for rain, but the reverent fascination of travellers who want to say they stood 3 feet from St. Somebody's jaw. Holiness in the age of tourism has been domesticated into museum etiquette. The commerce never left, it only changed uniforms. Where medieval hawkers flogged badges and bottles of holy water, cathedral gift shops now sell keychains, postcards and guidebooks stamped with saintly faces. Pilgrims once pinned tin shells to their cloaks. Tourists now pin enamel badges to their backpacks. The relic itself sits unchanged, silent in its reliquary, while the surrounding economy hums on, selling faith repackaged as souvenirs. Even the price structure feels familiar. Entry fees at cathedrals, donations, strongly suggested at the reliquary case, special tours for those willing to pay a little more. Salvation may no longer be for sale, but a guided relic tour with multilingual audio is. Modern skepticism hasn't killed the trade. If anything, it's fueled it. People come not just to believe, but to disbelieve. They lean close to relics, smirking as they whisper, "That can't possibly be real," while still feeling the shiver of centuries pressing down on them. Mockery and reverence blend seamlessly. You can laugh at the absurdity of 3 skulls for one saint, while still gasping at the craftsmanship of the reliquary. The relic doesn't need you to believe, it only needs you to look, and as long as you look, you'll drop a coin in the box or buy a trinket on the way out. Even politics lingers in the background. Nations still parade relics during major ceremonies, weaving them into state rituals as symbols of unity. Popes still bless the faithful with reliquaries during special occasions, their movements carefully televised for global audiences. The language has softened, fewer miracle promises, more emphasis on tradition, but the core hasn't shifted. Relics remain props in the performance of power, quietly anchoring authority in a way no speech or banner ever could. They are still the bones of legitimacy, rattling softly beneath the velvet and the gold. And so, 1,000 years later, relics have circled back to where they began. Not proof of holiness, not reliable medicine, not magical weapons, but artifacts that people can't stop gathering around. The desperate peasant has been replaced by the curious tourist, the hawker by the gift shop clerk, the miracle by the museum plaque. But the engine is the same: hope, fascination, and the willingness to pay for a glimpse of eternity in a gilded box. Relics endure not because they are real, but because humans need them to be. In the modern world, science has done what medieval satire never could. It poked relics with test tubes and microscopes. Carbon dating, DNA testing, and chemical analysis have been quietly exposing fraud for decades. Splinters of the true cross, when tested, turned out to be wood from centuries later, sometimes even pine instead of cedar. Supposed bones of saints have revealed themselves to belong to animals: cows, goats, even dogs. One particularly awkward test revealed a relic long venerated as John the Baptist's finger was, in fact, a fragment of someone who lived in the Middle Ages, not the 1st century. Yet each time the tests unveil another fraud, the faithful shrug. Science may prove the relics false, but devotion proves harder to dismantle. Some scandals have been brazen. In 2011, a relic of Pope John Paul II, a vial of his blood, was stolen from a church in Italy, sparking a nationwide hunt. It was eventually found discarded in a garage, its supposed holiness doing little to prevent it from being tossed aside like an empty bottle of wine. The theft revealed an uncomfortable truth: relics still attract thieves, collectors, and black market dealers, just as they did in the Middle Ages. The Vatican has quietly admitted to a thriving underground trade in relics, with objects circulating in private collections and occasionally surfacing at auctions where they are bid on like fine art. The line between faith and profiteering remains as blurred as ever, just now wrapped in modern secrecy instead of medieval spectacle. Even when authenticity crumbles, relics continue to draw crowds. The Shroud of Turin, tested and dated to the 14th century, remains one of the most visited relics in the world. Skeptics call it a forgery, scientists debate endlessly, but pilgrims still weep before it as if Christ himself had just stepped out of the linen. DNA tests may whisper fraud, but the faithful prefer the louder voice of tradition. In a sense, the relics have transcended authenticity. They are not holy because they are real. They are holy because people treat them as real. Belief paradoxically grows stronger the more it is challenged, as though doubt itself confirms the need for faith. Churches themselves have quietly adapted to the tension. Many no longer shout miracles but instead emphasize the symbolic value of relics. A bone may not literally belong to St. Stephen, they suggest, but venerating it connects you to the centuries of pilgrims who did believe. This reframing turns relics into cultural anchors rather than divine artifacts, protecting them from the embarrassment of DNA tests. The relic's authenticity becomes irrelevant. What matters is the continuity of devotion. It's a clever dodge, allowing cathedrals to keep their reliquaries on display without blushing each time a scientist releases another awkward lab result. Still, the evidence piles up, and with it, a shadow market of collectors who prefer their relics without scrutiny. Private buyers snap up fragments of bone, cloth and hair at auctions, sometimes for astronomical prices, even when provenance is shaky at best. The trade thrives in secrecy, fueled by the same impulses that once drove pilgrims to line muddy roads: the hunger to touch, own, or at least glimpse a piece of eternity. In this sense, relic culture hasn't died. It has simply slipped into quieter, more discreet channels, where scandal can be hidden more easily than in a medieval festival square. And yet, in the irony of ironies, relics still provoke public devotion. Crowds queue for hours to kiss reliquaries during papal events, television cameras broadcast processions, and newspapers cover the unveiling of bones as though reporting a royal wedding. Scientists may frown, skeptics may laugh, but the faithful still kneel, weep, and believe. The relic trade has survived schisms, reforms, scandals, and carbon dating, all because it runs on something stronger than truth: the human need for meaning. Bones may crumble, certificates may fail, but the ritual of reverence endures. The medieval madness, stripped of its mud and miracles, still rattles quietly under glass, and people keep showing up, wallets open, hearts exposed, as if nothing had changed at all. Medieval Europe was a theatre of relic discoveries, most of them as staged as a puppet show. Whole towns suddenly unearthed saints that no one had previously heard of, often at the precise moment when the local economy was on its knees. A farmer ploughing a field might miraculously strike a coffin, conveniently inscribed with the name of a martyr. Monks would arrive, declare the bones genuine, and cart them into the nearest church with solemn processions. Almost overnight the town transformed into a pilgrimage hub. It didn't matter that the saint in question had left no trace in any scripture. What mattered was that the bones were profitable. Relics weren't just found, they were manufactured, like divine currency minted to bail out struggling communities. Theft and translation of relics were so common they developed their own genre of miracle stories to excuse them. Monks didn't admit to stealing bones, they insisted the saint had chosen to leave. If relics went missing from a shrine and turned up in a rival church, it was said the saint had walked there, or mysteriously made himself lighter for the thieves carrying him away. These tales of self-moving saints were repeated with such conviction that people nodded reverently, ignoring the obvious. The only miracle was that monks could run so fast with heavy boxes of bones. Theft dressed in the robes of piety became not a crime but a holy migration, an excuse so convenient that nearly every major relic in Europe was translated at least once. The sheer variety of relics pushed imagination into parody. Every church wanted something unique to advertise, so bones alone weren't enough. You could find shreds of saints' clothing, locks of their hair, or even everyday objects repackaged as relics. Saintly staffs, belts, combs, and shoes were all paraded as holy. In one case, pilgrims flocked to venerate the chain that had once bound St. Peter, displayed with great solemnity. Rival churches, not to be outdone, produced their own chains of St. Peter, until it seemed the apostle had spent most of his life shackled like a professional escape artist. Duplication wasn't embarrassing, it was opportunity. If one relic was good, 10 were better, and each new shrine drew its own paying crowd. Miracle claims also kept escalating because once one town announced a relic that healed blindness, the next had to go further. Some relics allegedly raised the dead, though curiously only for a few minutes, just long enough to prove the miracle before the corpse inconveniently collapsed again. Others were said to bleed spontaneously, usually after being scratched by overeager clergy who just happened to have a vial of animal blood handy. A few even glowed faintly in the dark, though anyone who'd seen a mouldy skull in candlelight could attest that such glow was less miracle and more mildew. But pilgrims weren't scientists. They were desperate, and desperation makes fertile soil for outrageous stories. And then there were relics that blurred into outright carnival attractions. Some shrines allowed pilgrims to crawl through holes beneath altars, brushing their bodies against stones said to have touched holy bones. Others staged bizarre rituals where the relics were dunked into water, then sold as cure-all potions to the faithful. A few displayed relics during feasts where the atmosphere was closer to a fairground than a church, complete with jugglers, musicians, and drunken fights outside. The line between sacred and profane dissolved, leaving behind a spectacle that was equal parts religion and theatre. For every pilgrim who wept at a reliquary, there were 10 who treated the festival like a holiday count, loud, dirty, and profitable. All of it built toward the same lesson. Relics in the medieval world were never static objects. They were stories, weapons, spectacles, and most of all, opportunities. Every bone carried not just the memory of a saint, but the ambitions of whoever guarded it. Kings wielded them like sceptres, monks traded them like treasure, and peasants trudged endless miles to brush against them, hoping for salvation, or at least a distraction from misery. Whether genuine or forged, relics thrived because they fed the hunger of a world where miracles were in short supply and suffering was everywhere. Relic festivals, for all their holy wrapping, were magnets for impostors. Not everyone trudging along the road to Compostela or Rome was a true pilgrim. Many were beggars who discovered that wearing a scallop shell or a pilgrim badge opened purses faster than pity alone. The disguise was simple. Claim you were on your way to venerate a relic, cough a lot, limp theatrically, and mutter about miracles. Villagers who would have turned away an ordinary vagrant instead offered food and coins, terrified that turning away a pilgrim might anger heaven. Thus the highways of Europe filled with counterfeit saints in the making, each spinning elaborate tales of shrines they had visited or miracles they had half witnessed. Their suffering was rehearsed, their hunger genuine, and their profit margin surprisingly healthy. Festivals made this deception even easier. When tens of thousands gathered in muddy squares to see a reliquary paraded, no one kept track of who was sincere. A man could wander the crowd, claiming to have been healed, and watch donations fall into his hands as people scrambled to touch the blessed figure. Some carried forged badges to prove their journeys, cheap tins stamped crudely by blacksmiths who didn't ask questions. Others spun miracle stories about saints they'd never seen, retelling half-heard tales with dramatic embellishments. These impostors thrived because relic festivals were chaos, loud, crowded, drunk with spectacle, and in chaos a good liar could earn more than an honest pilgrim ever did. The genuine pilgrims often suffered from this competition. Villagers, weary of handing out bread and coins to endless streams of holy wanderers, began to distrust them all. "Are you truly returning from Compostela?" they'd sneer, "or just a rogue looking for free stew?" This suspicion gnawed at actual penitents, who staggered along barefoot and starving, only to be dismissed as frauds. Worse still, impostors sometimes arrived first, spinning tales of miraculous cures, so when the real pilgrims followed, their stories sounded tired and second-hand. Faith, which depended so heavily on storytelling, was poisoned by professional liars who made a business of holiness. But even among genuine pilgrims, imposture bled into ambition. Some realized that exaggerating their sufferings or inventing miracles along the way elevated their prestige back home. A man who merely trudged to Compostela was respectable. A man who claimed he saw angels swoop down above the reliquary was revered. Over time the line blurred. Were these pilgrims lying, or had their exhausted, feverish minds truly conjured visions in the candlelit chaos of a shrine? Either way, miracle inflation became part of the culture. The louder the story, the greater the reputation, and the more coins dropped into the next shrine's box. And for the clergy, impostors were both a problem and a boon. On one hand, they tarnished the credibility of pilgrimages, making villagers cynical and occasionally violent toward travelling strangers. On the other, they helped fuel the festival atmosphere. A crowd that saw miracles at every turn was more likely to donate, more likely to return home with tales that attracted the next wave of pilgrims. Bishops thundered against impostors in sermons, but quietly tolerated them in the festival squares, where their lies kept the holy fire burning. Hypocrisy was baked into the system, as much a part of the relic trade as golden reliquaries or the smell of incense over mud. Relic festivals were honeypots for crime, tens of thousands pressed together in filthy squares, clutching purses and prayer books, staring upward at reliquaries instead of downward at their belts. It was paradise for pickpockets. Thieves moved like fish in water, sliding through the crowds, cutting cords and vanishing into the press before anyone realized they'd been robbed. A pilgrim might stagger away boasting that his limp was healed, only to discover his coin pouch had disappeared in the process. Some said the saints worked in mysterious ways, others muttered that the saints seemed suspiciously fond of thieves. But the truth was simpler. A festival packed with gawping peasants was safer and more profitable for a cut-purse than the richest market square. Whole fraud rings flourished around relics. Men and women disguised as pilgrims set up stalls claiming to sell splinters of saints' bones or water, blessed by holy contact. These vendors were rarely lone actors. They worked in networks, supplying each other with forged trinkets and miracle stories. A group might pass the same skull around a dozen towns, changing the name of the saint each time to suit local tastes. In one place it was St. Lawrence, in another it was St. Martin, and by the time it reached the coast it had somehow transformed into St. Nicholas. Nobody kept track. Pilgrims were too eager to buy, and clergy were too eager to look the other way. Then there were the professional beggars who staged their miseries for maximum profit. A man might show up with bandages wrapped around his legs, wailing that he was crippled. At the height of the festival, after pressing himself against the reliquary, he would miraculously cast off the bandages and walk unaided. The crowd erupted, coins rained down, and by nightfall he was halfway to the next town, ready to limp again for a fresh audience. Sometimes whole troops of these impostors travelled together, coordinating their act so convincingly that even seasoned priests were fooled. Festivals became stages for their theatre, miracles reduced to cheap drama with a good payout. Crime also followed pilgrims on the road. The highways to Compostela, Rome and Jerusalem swarmed with bandits who understood that pilgrims were walking treasuries, pockets full of coin for donations, bags full of food, and often no weapons to defend themselves. Bands of robbers set up ambushes near shrines or campsites, stripping pilgrims of everything but the clothes on their backs. Worse still, some inns doubled as dens of thieves, their owners drugging guests with bad wine before relieving them of purses and badges. Many a pilgrim's relic story ended not in miracles but in ditches, robbed blind and lucky to still be breathing. Even the clergy were not immune to corruption. Some monasteries quietly skimmed coins from donation chests, or charged inflated fees for blessings. Others lost relics, only to have them rediscovered after a generous donor paid for a new reliquary. A few priests even partnered with thieves, letting them operate freely during festivals in exchange for a cut of the profits. To the pilgrim, all thefts were hidden behind incense smoke and pious chants. But behind the curtain, crime and devotion danced hand in hand, each feeding the other in a cycle as old as the bones themselves. The so-called holy journey began with feet, and feet were the first casualties. Pilgrims set out barefoot as a badge of piety, but after 3 days on rocky roads, their soles looked less like skin and more like overboiled turnips left too long in a pot. Blisters ballooned, cracked, and filled with mud, each step accompanied by a soundtrack of groans and muttered prayers that sounded suspiciously like curses. Monks preached that suffering purified the soul, but for most pilgrims the only thing being purified was their tolerance for pain. Those who tried wearing shoes fared little better. Cheap leather dissolved in rain, and wooden clogs rubbed until blood soaked through the straps. Walking barefoot toward salvation was less about holiness, and more about cultivating an intimate knowledge of every thorn on Europe's highways. The stench of the road was another trial. Pilgrims didn't travel alone. They moved in packs, eating whatever scraps they could scavenge and sleeping in heaps like livestock. Hygiene was a distant dream. Cabbage, the staple food of the poor, churned in every stomach, producing a miasma that clung to the group like an invisible cloak. Add to this the sweat of days without bathing, the reek of festering blisters, and the occasional accident when dysentery struck mid-march, and you had a procession less like a holy choir and more like a mobile compost heap. Divine visions might have visited the saints, but ordinary pilgrims were more likely to hallucinate from dehydration and the fumes rising off their fellow travellers. Dysentery was the great equalizer. Water sources along pilgrimage routes were rarely clean, but thirst overruled caution. One unlucky sip from a trough shared by oxen, and suddenly your holy journey became a sprint toward the nearest bush. Camps at night resounded with groans, coughs, and the occasional splash that was anything but baptismal. Yet this too was spun as penance. Monks reassured the faithful that bowels emptying uncontrollably was simply the body-purging sin. Pilgrims nodded weakly, clutching their stomachs, convinced that sanctity and stomach cramps were somehow linked. In practice, dysentery thinned their ranks more efficiently than any heresy trial. And after weeks of misery, what awaited at the shrine? Not radiant angels or booming voices from heaven, but bone fragments displayed in golden boxes, bones whose authenticity was always questionable. A chipped femur here, a tooth there, perhaps a shred of cloth or a rusty chain. Monks swore each piece had worked miracles, though the stories varied depending on which pilgrim you asked. Some claimed the relic cured blindness, others insisted it guaranteed fertility, while skeptics muttered it looked like the leftovers from a butcher's shop. Still, pilgrims wept and knelt, not because the relics looked convincing, but because after all the suffering they had to mean something. To admit otherwise would be to admit the journey had been little more than a blisters and bowel disaster tour of Europe. And yet, the anticlimax became its own kind of miracle. Pilgrims gazed at the relics, half delirious from hunger and exhaustion, and convinced themselves they felt divine power. Some claim their pain lifted instantly, though others noticed the effect faded as soon as they stepped outside the church and remembered their feet. Priests recorded every whispered cure, building an archive of miracles that made the shrine more popular each year. The cycle fed itself. Suffering created desperation, desperation created belief, and belief drew new waves of pilgrims, ready to turn their bodies into compost for the promise of touching a bone fragment someone swore belonged to Saint whoever. Arriving at a shrine was meant to be the grand climax of a holy journey, but more often It was like peeling back the curtain on a rigged carnival game. After weeks of hobbling, starving and praying, pilgrims finally shuffled into the darkened church, incense thick enough to choke a mule, only to find themselves staring at a golden box the size of a bread loaf. Inside? A bone fragment so tiny it could have fallen off a butcher's cart without anyone noticing. A monk would insist it was the shin of Saint whoever, though the size suggested it had come from a squirrel. Yet the crowd gasped, wept, and jostled for a chance to kiss the glass. Their misery transmuted into awe, because admitting disappointment would have shattered the entire purpose of the journey. The displays themselves were designed to dazzle, not to convince. Reliquaries gleamed with jewels, precious metals, and elaborate carvings, all calculated to distract the eye from the meagre scrap rattling inside. A single tooth might be nestled in a reliquary shaped like an entire jaw, giving the impression of grandeur until you leaned closer and realized you were venerating dentistry gone wrong. Some relics were displayed so high above the altar that pilgrims couldn't see them at all, forcing them to trust the word of monks that the sacred object wasn't just a pebble wrapped in velvet. Faith, in this context, meant squinting at glittering boxes and nodding as though you saw heaven peeking out of a molar. The miracle stories surrounding these relics were riddled with contradictions. One year, pilgrims swore a saint's arm bone cured lameness. The next, the same bone was praised for restoring sight. By the third, it had apparently cured infertility in half the county, though oddly the parish records showed no spike in christenings. Shrines leaned into this flexibility, advertising whatever ailment was most fashionable. If plague swept the land, suddenly the relic cured plague. If harvest failed, it blessed fields. Miracles shifted like a travelling salesman's pitch, tailored to whatever misery filled the pilgrim's life at the moment. The bones themselves stayed silent, but the stories around them multiplied endlessly. For many pilgrims, the disappointment was palpable, but unspoken. After weeks of hunger and blisters, staring at a chipped rib in a gold box felt like being handed a rusty nail after paying for a banquet. Yet the pressure to believe was immense. Everyone around you knelt, sobbed, and pressed coins into donation chests. To scoff was to risk heresy, and worse, to admit your suffering had been for nothing. So pilgrims forced themselves into awe, convincing their weary bodies that the shiver in their spine was divine rather than exhaustion. They left with lighter purses, heavier trinket bags, and the unspoken knowledge that heaven looked a lot like a bone in a box, and still the cycle continued, because the anticlimax was never the end. It was the beginning of the tale. Pilgrims returned home and told stories not of disappointment, but of miracles, omitting the smell of cabbage, the dysentery, and the blisters. They spoke of radiant relics, of visions glimpsed in candlelight, of cures that may or may not have happened. Their neighbours, impressed or envious, pinned the stories to memory, and the legend of the shrine grew larger than the experience itself. The relics didn't need to impress in the moment. They only needed to inspire tales. And tales, in medieval Europe, were the most valuable currency of all. In the end, relics were less about bones and more about the endless human need to make misery meaningful. Pilgrims blistered their feet into pulp, choked on incense, and kissed glass smeared with other people's spit, all for a glimpse of fragments that were as likely to be animal bones as saintly remains. Shrines spun miracle tales like merchants spinning wool, monks guarded coffers as fiercely as soldiers guarded castles, and kings waved reliquaries as though God himself had signed their charters. And yet, through all the fraud, filth, and farce, the relics endured, because people wanted them to. In a world of famine, plague, and war, a chipped bone in a golden box was less a scam than a survival mechanism, a fragile hope wrapped in spectacle. The saints may never have moved a finger, but the stories around them moved the world,